how pirates actually slept on a freezing ship without heating. Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into a hammock aboard a pirate ship in the middle of the North Atlantic, in weather that has absolutely no business showing up in anyone's daydream about pirate life. Ice thick as a man's thumb crusting the rigging, spray freezing solid before it even lands on deck, and not one single working source of heat anywhere between you and water cold enough to kill a strong swimmer in under 20 minutes. Somewhere in the middle of all that, on the night of April 17th, 1717, a pirate galley called the Wider Galley went down in a nor'easter off Cape Cod with 146 men aboard her. 2 of them lived to see the sun come up. Welcome to the freezing, forgotten side of the Golden Age of Piracy. The side almost nobody pictures when they picture a pirate ship at all, and the one we're spending tonight inside of. Go ahead and dim the lights if you haven't already, and if you've got a fan or a white noise machine nearby, let it hum low and steady tonight, like wind working its way through frozen rigging 200 miles from land. You're warm right now, wherever you're lying. Blankets, maybe. A roof that doesn't move. That won't be true where we're going. Let's ease into tonight's journey together, into the coldest nights the so-called Golden Age of Piracy ever produced. You signed the articles 3 weeks ago, and the ink is still the newest thing about you. Everything else is borrowed, second-hand or stolen. The coat off a dead Portuguese sailor, the boots that don't quite fit, the hammock some other man swung in before he went over the side, or under the knife, or, if he was lucky, into a longboat at some forgotten harbor with his share in a sack. That hammock is the first thing anyone hands you when you come aboard a pirate ship, and for the length of the voyage, it is the only private property you will reliably have. A rolled length of canvas, roughly 6 feet by 3, slung on 2 hooks between the deck beams, swaying with the roll of the ship whether you want it to or not. Here's the thing nobody tells you about hammocks. They were, by the standards of the age, a genuinely clever piece of naval engineering, adapted from Caribbean indigenous designs that European sailors encountered in the 16th century and never stopped using, because a swinging bed keeps a sleeping man roughly level even when the deck beneath him is not. On a ship pitching in a heavy sea, that matters. What it does not do is keep you warm. Canvas has no insulating value to speak of. You are, in effect, sleeping in a sling made of sailcloth, suspended in the coldest, dampest space on the entire vessel, 4 feet above bilgewater that never quite stops sloshing. The man slung next to you tonight is called Nathaniel Rusk, and he did not choose to be here any more than the coat on your back chose to leave its original owner. Rusk was a sailmaker's mate on a Bristol merchantman 3 months ago, taken along with his ship off the Grand Banks, and given the choice every forced man got. Sign the articles and take a share, or don't, and take your chances rowing to shore in November. He signed. Most did. He still mends canvas for a living, only now the canvas is a black flag as often as a mainsail, and he still hums while he works. A habit that has already gotten him elbowed awake twice this week by men who wanted their 4 hours of sleep in silence. You've noticed, he sleeps in his coat. Everyone does. Nobody undresses for bed on this ship, not in April, not in these latitudes. You lie down in whatever you stood watch in, boots included if you can stand it, because the alternative is losing another quarter hour of body heat to canvas and cold iron before you've even closed your eyes. The old hands call this turning in dressed for a fire drill, and it is not entirely a joke. A ship can catch flame or take on water at any hour, and the man who undressed for comfort is the man who goes over the rail in his shirt sleeves. Rusk shifts, the hammock ropes creak, and somewhere above you the watch bell rings out the half hour. You have, by your best count, 90 minutes left before someone shakes you awake for the middle watch. You close your eyes anyway. Sleep, on a ship like this, is not a guarantee. It's a wager you place every single night, against the weather, against the bell, against the cold, working its way up through 6 feet of canvas. And tonight, Like most nights, you'll take whatever hand you're dealt. The cold doesn't come from the air first, it comes from below. That's the part that surprises people who've never spent a night below decks on a wooden ship. You'd expect the chill to arrive through the open hatches, riding in on the wind, and some of it does. But the deeper, more relentless cold rises straight up through the hull, planking itself, through 6 or 8 inches of oak that has spent every hour of this voyage submerged in seawater, running somewhere between 38 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit in these North Atlantic waters, come April. Wood is a poor insulator when it's saturated, and by 3 weeks out, the lower planking of most pirate vessels was permanently damp, wicking cold up into the frames, into the deck beams, into the very air of the berth deck, where you and 80 or 90 other men are trying to sleep. There is no ballast of warm air to counteract it. No stove burns down here. Open flame below decks on a wooden ship, loaded with gunpowder, was one of the few rules every pirate captain enforced without a vote, articles or no articles, because a single overturned lantern could end the voyage faster than any Royal Navy frigate. So the only heat in this space is the heat coming off other bodies. And on a ship this size, that's not nothing. 90 sleeping men throw off a genuine, measurable warmth, the same principle that keeps a crowded room from feeling as cold as an empty one. It's just nowhere near enough to counter 40-degree oak. You can feel it most in your feet first, then your hands, then a slow ache that settles into your lower back from lying still against damp canvas for hours at a stretch. The ship's surgeon, when a pirate crew was fortunate enough to have one, willing or otherwise, kept a running tally of complaints that reads like a weather report. Joint pain, chest colds, a persistent cough that moved through the crew berth by berth like gossip. Rheumatism was so common among sailors of the era that period physicians simply called it the sailor's disease, and ship surgeons across multiple documented Royal Navy and merchant logs from the period noted it as one of the 2 or 3 most frequent complaints on any long voyage, right alongside scurvy and flux. Rusk has started coughing tonight, a dry, catching sound he's clearly trying to keep quiet, muffled against his borrowed coat collar. You notice it because you've noticed everything about him this week. That's what happens in close quarters. You learn a man's habits whether you mean to or not. And you notice, too, that he doesn't complain. Nobody does. Much. Complaining uses breath, and breath is one more thing you're trying to conserve tonight. Somewhere 3 feet from your head, a beam creaks against the cold, the way old wood does when temperature drops fast, a sound like the ship itself shivering, and you pull your knees up an inch closer to your chest and wait for the watch bell. The bell finds you before real sleep does. 8 bells, and then, cruelly, 1 bell again. The first stroke of a new watch cycle starting the count over, the way it does every 4 hours around the clock, day and night, storm or calm, for the entire length of the voyage. This is the part landsmen never quite grasp about naval sleep. There is no such thing as a night's rest on a ship under sail. There is only the watch system, splitting the crew into 2, sometimes 3 groups, each standing 4 hours of duty, followed by 4 hours below, a rhythm so relentless that sailors of the period had a specific, weary vocabulary for it. Watch and watch. They called the standard 2-watch rotation, and it meant exactly what it sounds like. 4 hours on deck, 4 hours in your hammock, repeated without pause until the voyage ended, or you did. Do the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is the whole point. 4 hours off does not mean 4 hours of sleep. Strip out the time it takes to climb down from deck, find your hammock in the dark, get your boots off, if you're brave enough to risk it, and you're closer to 3.5 hours of actual unconsciousness, if nothing interrupts you, which something almost always does. A sail needs trimming. A shout goes up that a strange ship's been sighted on the horizon. Someone's hammock rope gives way and dumps him, cursing, onto the deck below, and half the berth wakes up laughing before drifting back off, the moment already becoming one of those small shared jokes that circulate through a crew for weeks. Pirate crews, it's worth saying, sometimes had it slightly better than their Royal Navy counterparts in exactly one respect, because they typically sailed with far larger crews relative to ship size than merchant vessels. A pirate sloop might carry 80 men, where a merchantman of the same size sailed with 12. There were, in practice, more hands to split watch duty among. Bartholomew Roberts' Royal Fortune reportedly carried crews well over 200 at points, nearly 10 times the number a merchant ship her size would have needed. That oversized crew was partly there for fighting strength in a boarding action, but it also meant shorter, less brutal rotations than the chronically undermanned merchant ships most of these men had been press-ganged or recruited off of. Small comfort, perhaps, but a real one, and one more reason a hard life under the black flag sometimes beat a harder one under a merchant's articles. Still, 3.5 broken hours, twice in 24, night after night, for the length of a voyage that could run 6 months or more. You're doing that arithmetic now, half asleep, half furious about it, when the bell rings its final stroke and a hand grips your shoulder in the dark. Rusk, you too. Middle watch. Neither of you says anything. You just start finding your boots, which, dressed as you are, takes considerably less time than it would for a man who'd undressed for comfort, which, again, is exactly the point. Here's the thing about clothing on a freezing pirate ship. There wasn't much of it, and what there was, you fought for. Pirate crews did not sail with a ship's slop chest stocked the way a well-run naval vessel's was, issuing standardized wool jackets and watch coats to every hand. What clothing existed aboard a pirate ship came almost entirely from prizes, captured cargo, a dead man's sea chest, divided among the crew, whatever a merchant vessel happened to be carrying when it was taken. This produced a strange and well-documented effect. Pirate crews, when captured or described by witnesses, were repeatedly noted for the sheer, almost theatrical mismatch of their clothing. Silk waistcoats over homespun shirts, a captured naval officer's coat worn by a man with bare, cracked feet, because whatever came off the last prize got distributed, worn, and eventually worn out, regardless of whether it actually suited the climate. Which meant that on a run north into cold Atlantic waters, you dressed in whatever the last 6 months of piracy happened to have handed you, and prayed it included wool. Wool, unlike the linen and cotton that made up most period clothing, retained some insulating value even when wet. A genuinely important property at sea, where staying bone dry for an entire watch was close to impossible. A man who'd captured a decent wool coat off a Boston-bound merchantman was, in a very real sense, a wealthier man tonight than one who'd taken a finer silk one, whatever the silk had cost its original owner. You got lucky. 6 weeks back, a captured Dutch trader yielded a chest of heavy wool watchcoats meant for its own northern-bound crew, and the quartermaster, under most pirate articles, the man responsible for dividing plunder fairly among the company, a role considered second in authority only to the captain himself, split them out by lot rather than by rank, the same system used for splitting any other prize. It's a detail that tends to surprise people. On a Royal Navy ship, the captain's cabin would have first pick of anything valuable pulled from a prize. On a pirate ship, operating under written articles, a system most companies of the Golden Age genuinely did adopt. Whatever else about pirate life has been exaggerated by legend, the coat you're wearing tonight was distributed by the same lottery that decided everyone else's. Rusk didn't win a coat in that draw. He's wearing 2 shirts instead, one over the other, and the coat he does have is the same one he came aboard in, patched twice already at the elbow with a scrap of sailcloth he stitched himself, because a sailmaker's mate, forced man or not, is never without a needle. You offered him your spare shirt last week without really thinking about it, and he took it without making a thing of it, the way men do when the gesture and the acceptance both need to stay small to survive being noticed. Out here, that's closer to friendship than anything with a name attached to it. Somewhere around the 2nd hour of your watch, it starts to rain. Not hard. A fine, needling drizzle, that the wind drives sideways rather than down, the kind of rain that seems specifically engineered to find every gap in a coat rather than simply falling on you. By the time 8 bells sounds and you're relieved, you are, by any reasonable definition, soaked through. Shirt, coat, the wool watch cap someone lent you back in March, all of it holding water instead of shedding it. You climb below, already knowing what's waiting for you, and it isn't dry canvas. It's condensation. Sailors of the period had a blunt, practical name for it. They called it the ship's sweat, and it was one of the most universally hated features of life below decks on any wooden vessel, pirate, naval, or merchant alike. Picture it plainly. 90 men breathing, sweating, and in some cases coughing, in an enclosed space with minimal ventilation, all of that moisture rising and meeting cold oak deck beams overhead, condensing there the way a cold glass of water sweats on a summer table. Except here, it doesn't stay on the beam. It drips, steadily, unpredictably, onto whoever's hammock happens to be underneath, all night long, regardless of whether it's raining outside or not. There was no real solution to this in the age of sail. Some captains ordered the hatches propped open in fair weather, specifically to let the moisture-laden air escape and dry air circulate, a genuine and documented practice. But propping the hatches open in a Nor-Atlantic April meant trading condensation for a straight blast of 38-degree air, which nobody actually preferred. Vinegar was sometimes splashed around the berth deck in an attempt to counter the smell and, sailors believed, the bad air itself, an idea rooted in the era's miasma theory of disease, the widespread belief that foul-smelling air itself caused illness. It didn't stop the drip, nothing really did. You find your hammock and discover a fresh wet patch has formed directly over where your head goes, courtesy of a beam 3 feet up, that's been sweating steadily since sundown. You shift the hammock 2 feet forward along its hooks, which solves the drip and creates a new problem. You're now hanging directly over the mainmast step, where the deck beams are lowest, and you crack your forehead against one within 30 seconds of lying down. Rusk, half asleep already, laughs quietly enough not to wake the men on either side of him, and you decide, rubbing your head in the dark, that you'd rather be laughed at than dripped on, and settle in for what's left of the night. There's a superstition worth knowing about, because it tells you something true about how these men understood their own mortality, even if the belief itself doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Sailors across the Golden Age of Piracy, the loose 30-year window roughly spanning the 1690s through the 1720s that produced most of the names people still recognize, Blackbeard and Bartholomew Roberts, and Calico Jack among them, widely held that a man should never take up the hammock of someone recently killed or lost overboard without some gesture of respect first, a muttered word, a coin left in the canvas folds, sometimes simply refusing the hammock outright, and sleeping rolled in a spare sail, on deck instead. Cold be damned. The belief wasn't universal, and wasn't formally recorded in any single ship's articles that survive, but period accounts and later maritime folklore both point to the same underlying anxiety, repeated across enough independent sources that historians treat it as a genuine and widespread shipboard practice, rather than pure invention. It makes a certain brutal sense once you sit with it. A hammock on a ship this size wasn't an abstraction. It was 6 feet of canvas that had, quite recently and quite literally, held the shape of a specific man's body, night after night, for however long he'd sailed with you. When that man went into the sea during a boarding action, or slipped below during a fever that moved through the crew the way fevers did on any ship with poor food and poor water, his hammock didn't disappear. It got reissued, sometimes within days, to whichever new hand needed one. A forced man just brought aboard, or simply the sailor whose old one had finally rotted through. Sleeping in it meant sleeping, quite directly, in the last private space a dead shipmate had occupied. Rusk mentioned this to you on your 3rd night aboard, half as a warning, and half, you suspected, as a test of how you'd take it. The hammock you're in tonight, he told you, belonged to a topman named Ferris, who'd gone over the side in a squall 6 weeks before you came aboard, and nobody had thought to say anything over it because the weather that night hadn't given anyone the time. Rusk said a word for him anyway, quietly, the first night you slung it. Not because he'd known Ferris well, but because somebody ought to, and it seemed like the kind of gesture that cost nothing and might matter. You didn't ask what he said. It felt like the sort of thing you weren't meant to ask. The way certain private rituals stay private, even among men living 4 feet apart from each other for months at a stretch. What you did instead, without really deciding to, was start doing something similar yourself. The next time a hand went down with fever and didn't get up. Not a prayer, exactly, not from you, but a moment of stillness before you climbed into whatever hammock came free. It doesn't warm anything, it doesn't change anything about tomorrow's watch. But it's yours now, this small ritual, the way it was Ferris's hammock before it was yours, and the way it'll belong to someone else's small private ceremony after you. By your 4th week aboard, you've learned exactly where the warmest berth on this entire ship is located, and it isn't yours. It's aft, behind a door that stays shut, in the great cabin where the captain sleeps. And on a handful of better provisioned pirate vessels, that cabin held something the rest of the ship simply did not. A small iron stove, or brazier, carefully positioned and carefully watched, burning low enough to take the worst edge off the cold without setting the ship alight. This wasn't universal. Most pirate captains, like most naval and merchant captains of the era, went without any heat source at all, for the same fire safety reasons that kept the berth deck dark and flameless. But where a captain's quarters were roomy enough and the crew's articles permitted it, a contained brazier in the great cabin, tended personally and never left burning unattended, shows up often enough in period accounts to count as a real and recognized feature of shipboard hierarchy. Here's what makes pirate ships genuinely different from naval or merchant vessels on this exact point, and it's worth sitting with, because it cuts against the popular image of a pirate captain as an unaccountable tyrant. Under the written articles that governed most Golden Age pirate crews, real documents, several of which survive in something close to their original form, including sets attributed to Bartholomew Roberts and to John Phillips, a captain's authority over the ship's comforts was not absolute. Captains were elected by crew vote and could be, and regularly were, voted out again if the company judged them unfit, cowardly, or too free with resources that belonged, in theory, to the whole company. A captain who hoarded warmth, food, or plunder disproportionately risked exactly the fate that met several documented pirate captains of the era. A vote, a demotion, sometimes worse. That doesn't mean the captain's cabin was equal to the berth deck. It wasn't, and nobody aboard pretended otherwise. But it does mean the gap was narrower and more contested than it would have been on almost any other kind of ship sailing these same waters in 1717. A Royal Navy captain's comfort was simply a fact of naval hierarchy, unquestioned and unquestionable. A pirate captain's comfort was, at least in principle, on loan from a crew that had voted him into the job and could vote him back out of it, which is a strange kind of comfort to hold, if you think about it, warm as it might be. You've thought about this more than once, lying in a hammock 4 feet above cold bilge water, while somewhere aft, a small fire burns behind a shut door. It doesn't make you warmer, but it's a different kind of arrangement than the one Rusk's old merchant captain ran, where the only vote that mattered belonged to the owners back in Bristol, and the crew's comfort was never so much as a line item worth considering. Here, at least, it's a live question. Here, at least, somebody could, in theory, do something about it. Near the end of the middle watch, something moves across your foot in the dark, and you know exactly what it is before you're even fully awake. Rats. A wooden ship carrying stores of salted meat, hardtack, and grain was functionally a floating rat habitat, and pirate vessels, often taken as prizes from merchant fleets already infested, and rarely equipped with the ratting cats that better-run naval ships sometimes kept specifically to manage the problem, tended to run worse than most. Ship's logs and captains' depositions from the period reference rat damage to stores with startling regularity. Gnawed rope, fouled biscuit, entire barrels of provisions condemned as unfit after an infestation got into them. On a cold night, rats moved toward the same thing every other creature aboard was chasing, whatever warmth the berth deck's crowded bodies gave off, which meant they ran freely across hammocks, across sleeping men, across you, tonight, at some hour you can't quite place in the dark. You've stopped reacting to it the way you did your first week aboard, when a rat running across your chest had you awake and swearing before you'd even registered what happened. Now you just shift, mutter something Rusk laughs at from 2 feet away, and try to get back under before the cold fully reclaims the small pocket of warmth you'd built up in your borrowed coat. It's a strange kind of adaptation, this, the body learning, within a matter of weeks, to sleep through things that would have been unthinkable in whatever life you had before this one, whether that life was a Bristol dockside, or in Rusk's case, a sailmaker's loft that smelled of tar and canvas instead of bilge water and wet rope. What you haven't adapted to, not yet, 4 weeks in, is the sound the ship makes in genuinely rough weather, a deep, groaning complaint from the hull itself, timber working against timber that runs underneath every other noise on the berth deck like a bass note under a melody. Tonight it's mild, nothing more than the ordinary creak of a ship riding an ordinary swell, but you've heard it worse, twice now, in squalls that had half the crew awake and gripping their hammock ropes white-knuckled, waiting to see whether the noise was just the ship talking to itself or the ship telling you something you needed to act on. Rusk sleeps through most of it these days, or seems to. You suspect, though you've never asked, that he's simply gotten good at faking it, the same performance of calm that half the crew has learned to put on for the other half's benefit. Fear is contagious below decks in a way that's almost as dangerous as fire. A crew that panics together in the dark makes mistakes on deck the next morning, and mistakes on deck, in weather like this, in waters this cold, are the kind that don't give you a second chance to fix them. 3 weeks from tonight, though you don't know it yet, this exact stretch of the North Atlantic will turn into the worst storm most of these men have ever sailed through. A nor'easter violent enough to end the entire voyage, for a very large number of people not so different from you and Rusk, sleeping 4 feet above cold bilge water on a ship not so different from this one. But tonight, it's just cold, and it's just late, and the watch bell that will end your 4 hours below is still an hour off. You've learned, these past weeks, to treat that hour the way you'd treat any other scarce resource aboard, not wasted on worry, because worry doesn't buy you anything you don't already have, and not spent trying to solve problems, the cold, the damp, the rats, the bone-deep exhaustion of watch and watch, that 4 weeks aboard have already taught, you cannot be solved, only endured. What you can do, and what you find yourself doing more nights than not, is talk quietly with Rusk in the dark, the two of you keeping your voices low enough not to draw complaints from the men trying actually to sleep around you. Tonight he's telling you about Bristol, about a sail loft that smelled permanently of tar and canvas dust, about a master who taught him to palm a needle before he was 12 years old. You find yourself telling him things you hadn't planned on telling anyone aboard this ship. Not confessions exactly, just the ordinary shape of a life, the kind of thing that gets exchanged between men who don't know yet whether they'll still be shipmates in a month, and who have, in the meantime, exactly this: 4 feet of shared dark, a ship's sweat dripping somewhere nearby, and however much of the watch is left before the bell finds you both again. It isn't warmth, not really, but it's something adjacent to it, this quiet trade of ordinary details between two men who have nothing else to give each other tonight. And it will matter more than either of you expects, 3 weeks from now, when the storm that's already forming somewhere out past the horizon finally arrives, and the two of you discover, in the worst possible way, exactly how much 4 weeks of shared cold and shared dark is actually worth. The bell rings. 8 bells, then 1. Somewhere above, a new watch is climbing up into weather that hasn't warmed at all since you came below, and you and Rusk pull your borrowed coats tighter and try, one more time tonight, to sleep. That storm is real, and it's coming, and it belongs to a ship with a name and a captain and a story of its own, which is where tonight's journey turns next. She was called the Wider Galley, and on the 26th of February 1717, she was still a slave ship, 3 months out from London, riding low in the water off the West African coast, with a hold full of human cargo she'd take across the Atlantic to be sold in the Caribbean. By the time she went down 14 months later, she had become something else entirely, the flagship of the most successful pirate captain of his brief career, carrying more looted gold and silver than any pirate vessel captured or wrecked in the entire Golden Age of Piracy would be found to hold. This is the story of the Wider, the ship that made a shoemaker's son into a legend, and then, in under an hour on a freezing April night, killed almost everyone aboard her. Samuel Bellamy was, by most surviving accounts, an Englishman of unremarkable origin, a shipwright's or labourer's son from Devon, by the most credible tracing of the sparse records, who arrived in the Caribbean sometime around 1715, with nothing much to recommend him but ambition and, according to the legend that grew up around him almost immediately after his death, a romance with a Cape Cod woman named Maria Hallett that historians today treat with real skepticism. The story appears nowhere in contemporary records and seems to have crystallized decades later. The kind of tale that attaches itself to a dead pirate the way barnacles attach to a hull. What is documented through Admiralty records, captain's depositions, and the eventual court proceedings against his surviving crew is considerably less romantic and considerably more interesting. Bellamy fell in with a crew of wreckers and small-time pirates working the Bahamas, proved himself a capable and unusually well-liked leader, and within about a year had talked his way into command of his own pirate company. He earned a nickname that tells you almost everything about how his own crew regarded him: Black Sam, not for cruelty, but reportedly for his habit of going without the powdered wig fashionable among gentlemen of the era, wearing his own dark hair tied back instead. A small vanity, if the story is accurate, but also possibly later embellishment, since the nickname's origin isn't independently confirmed outside of secondary retellings. More reliably documented is a different title entirely, one that appears in period accounts of his conduct toward captured crews, the Prince of Pirates, and even, by some tellings that should be treated as legend rather than settled fact, the Robin Hood of the Seas, descriptions that stuck to him because he had an unusual, and by several contemporary accounts genuine, habit of treating captured sailors with restraint rather than brutality, offering forced men fair treatment, and, on more than one documented occasion, releasing captured vessels largely intact once he'd taken what he wanted from them. Whatever the precise truth of his personality, one thing is not in dispute. By February of 1717, Samuel Bellamy commanded a small pirate flotilla, and he was about to become spectacularly, historically rich. The Wider Galley was, before Bellamy ever laid eyes on her, one of the finest and fastest vessels of her class afloat, a purpose-built slave ship, 300 tons, armed with 18 guns, capable of speeds that outran nearly anything the Royal Navy could send after her. Her captain, Lawrence Prince, had just completed the brutal Middle Passage crossing and sold his human cargo in Jamaica, and was sailing home to London with a hold full of the proceeds: gold dust, silver coin, sugar, indigo, and other valuable trade goods, when Bellamy's flotilla caught up with her off the Bahamas in late February 1717. What followed was, by the standards of pirate engagements, almost anticlimactic. A 3-day chase, and then Prince, recognizing he was hopelessly outgunned and outmanned, surrendered without a serious fight. Bellamy did something at that moment that tells you a great deal about the man, whatever the more romantic legends around him deserve to be doubted. He didn't just loot the Whydah and sail off in his own smaller ship. He took the Whydah herself, recognizing, correctly, that he'd captured a faster, better armed, better built vessel than his own, and in a gesture, unusually generous even by the loose standards of pirate conduct, gave Captain Prince his own former ship, the Sultana, along with enough silver to make the loss survivable, and let him sail away. It was, functionally, an even trade in Bellamy's favor, dressed up as an act of mercy, and it worked exactly as intended. Prince lived to give a detailed deposition about the encounter, which is a significant part of why we know as much as we do today about what happened next. What Bellamy did next with his new flagship reveals a captain thinking less like a smash-and-grab raider and more like a man building an institution. He spent weeks refitting the Whydah for war rather than trade, cutting her gun ports open wider and increasing her armament from 18 guns to a reported 28 or 29. Historians differ slightly on the exact final count, since the surviving records come from later depositions rather than a ship's inventory, but every account agrees the number rose substantially. A slave ship, built for speed and cargo capacity, became, under Bellamy's direction, one of the most heavily armed pirate vessels then sailing the Atlantic, fast enough to run down nearly any merchant vessel afloat, and armed heavily enough that few captains, having seen her guns run out, bothered putting up a fight worth dying over. The crew that manned her was, by the standards of 1717, a genuinely unusual assembly of men, and it's worth pausing on exactly how unusual, because it says something real about what pirate life offered that almost nothing else at sea in this period did. Documented accounts of the Whydah's company, drawn from later trial records of the survivors captured elsewhere in Bellamy's fleet, describe a crew that included English, Dutch, French and Mosquito sailors, alongside a substantial number of men of African descent, some of them formerly enslaved, sailing now under the same written articles as everyone else aboard, entitled to the same vote, the same share of plunder, the same say in whether the captain kept his post. This wasn't universal pirate practice. Plenty of pirate crews of the era were exploitative or outright brutal toward captured black sailors, and the popular modern image of pirate ships as havens of racial equality is considerably oversimplified. But on ships like the Whydah, under captains like Bellamy, the written articles genuinely did extend real standing to men who would have had none anywhere else in the Atlantic world of 1717, a fact documented directly in the trial testimony of the crew members who were eventually captured and tried. Among that crew was a young man named John Julian, likely somewhere around 16 years old, of mixed Mosquito and African heritage, who served the Whydah as a pilot, a role of genuine technical skill and responsibility, guiding the ship through the shoal-heavy, treacherous waters of the American coastline that European navigators found notoriously difficult to read. The Mosquito people of Central America's eastern coast had, by this period, developed a well-earned reputation among English sailors as extraordinarily skilled coastal navigators and fishermen, and men with that background were actively sought out by pirate crews operating in American waters for exactly the expertise Julian brought aboard. He is not a figure historians know a great deal about, beyond the bare outline the records give us. His exact age, his exact role, and his ultimate fate are all subjects of some dispute among historians working from incomplete sources. But what is documented is enough to place him, this specific spring, doing exactly this specific job. Standing near the helm, reading water most of the crew couldn't read at all, keeping a heavily laden pirate flagship off the sandbars that had wrecked lesser ships up and down this same coast for a century before Bellamy ever sailed it. By April of 1717, Bellamy's flotilla had taken more than 50 prizes over the preceding year, an extraordinary run by any measure, one that historians studying pirate careers of the era generally rank among the most lucrative of the entire Golden Age, rivaling or exceeding hauls attributed to far more famous names like Blackbeard. The most recent and richest of these captures was the Mary Ann, a sloop loaded with a cargo of Madeira wine, taken just days earlier off the coast near Nantucket. And with the season turning and the run of prizes proving good, Bellamy made the decision that would end his life. He turned his flotilla north, toward Cape Cod, intending to put in briefly near the town of Eastham before continuing on. The Wider, the Mary Ann, and a third vessel set out together up the Massachusetts coastline on the afternoon of April 26, 1717, sailing directly into weather nobody aboard had any way of fully anticipating. The barometer, if the Wider carried one, and many well-provisioned ships of the era did, even if the instrument's readings were still poorly understood as a predictive tool, would have been dropping fast that afternoon, though nobody aboard had the meteorological framework to read that drop as the warning it was. What they had instead was experience, and by early evening, experience was telling every hand aboard the same thing. The sky to the northeast had gone the wrong color. The wind was backing around in a way that seasoned sailors of the New England coast recognized as the signature of a nor'easter, and the temperature, already cold for late April, was falling further by the hour. A nor'easter is not, structurally, a hurricane, and it wasn't the raw wind speed that made this storm the killer it became. Contemporary and modern analyses both suggest sustained winds in the range of a strong gale rather than a full hurricane force event. What made it lethal was the combination of factors converging on one specific stretch of coastline: hurricane-adjacent wave heights whipped up by a long fetch of open ocean, a falling tide interacting violently with the storm surge, and a treacherous, shoaling seafloor off the outer arm of Cape Cod that turned deep-water waves into breaking surf far earlier and far more violently than deep-water sailors were prepared for. Bellamy's flotilla, running for shelter, found itself instead running directly into the shallowest, most dangerous water on the entire New England coast, in the dark, in worsening wind, with visibility collapsing into driving rain and spray. By 9 o'clock that night, the Wider was in genuine trouble, and the crew knew it. The ship was overloaded, riding low in the water under the weight of 50 prizes worth of accumulated plunder, much of it likely stowed low in the hold for stability during ordinary sailing, which now worked against her, reducing her freeboard and making her dangerously slow to rise over the breaking waves that were, by every surviving account, cresting at heights the crew described afterward as unlike anything most of them had seen. John Julian, at the helm or near it, was doing exactly the job he'd been brought aboard to do, reading water in conditions that made reading water close to impossible, trying to find a channel through breakers that had already claimed lesser ships on this exact stretch of coast for 100 years before this particular April night. It didn't work. Sometime around 10 or 11 o'clock, by the best reconstruction survivors and witnesses on shore, were later able to piece together, the Wider struck the outer bar roughly 500 feet from the beach, near what is now Wellfleet, Massachusetts, close enough, in daylight and calm water, to swim. In a nor'easter, in April cold surf, in full darkness, 500 feet might as well have been 500 miles. The ship began breaking apart almost immediately, her mainmast reportedly snapping and crashing down across the deck, crushing or trapping men who had, moments before, still believed there was a version of tonight where they lived to see morning. What happened over the next hour is, by nature of the disaster itself, only partially recoverable. Nobody was taking notes, and the men who might have told the fullest version of it mostly did not survive to tell it. What the historical record does preserve, through the later depositions of the two men who did live, and through the accounts of local residents who witnessed pieces of it from shore, is a picture stitched together from fragments. Men going into water cold enough to induce hypothermia and incapacitation within minutes, well before drowning itself became the immediate cause of death for most of them. Wreckage and bodies washing ashore for days afterward along miles of Cape Cod beach. And a ship that had, hours earlier, been the wealthiest pirate vessel in the Atlantic, now scattered across the seafloor in pieces, her hold of gold dust and silver coin spilling into the sand of a coastline that would keep pieces of it hidden for the next 267 years. The numbers, where we have them, are almost too stark to need commentary. Somewhere close to 146 men were aboard the Wider that night. 2 survived the wreck itself. Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter who had been forced into Bellamy's crew from a captured vessel some months earlier. His skills too valuable to let him go, the way skilled tradesmen like carpenters, surgeons, and navigators frequently were retained against their will even by pirate crews that released ordinary sailors freely. And John Julian, the young Mosquito African pilot who had spent the storm's final hour trying and failing to read a passage through breakers that had no readable passage left to give. Both men reportedly survived by clinging to wreckage that washed them, eventually, and by pure chance, close enough to shore to be pulled from the surf, more dead than alive, by local residents who had come down to the beach once word of the wreck spread. Local response arrived with a speed that tells you something about how thin the line was, in this period, between coastal settlement and outright wrecking. Within hours, and certainly by first light, residents of Eastham and the surrounding Cape Cod towns were on the beach, some to help survivors, many more to strip the tide of whatever it had brought them, a practice so common along this exact stretch of coast that Massachusetts authorities had passed specific laws against it decades earlier, laws that were, by every account of what actually happened on this beach in the days following the wreck, almost entirely ignored. Silver coin, gold dust, cloth, tools, and pieces of the ship itself vanished into local hands faster than colonial authorities could organize any kind of official salvage, and it took the direct intervention of the Massachusetts governor, who dispatched a cartographer and captain named Cyprian Southack specifically to secure what remained of the wreck and recover what plunder he could on the Crown's behalf, to even begin restoring anything resembling official order to the scene. Southack's own surviving letters and reports from the recovery effort are, today, one of the single most valuable primary sources historians have for reconstructing exactly what happened that night. He interviewed survivors, catalogued what could be recovered, and left behind a documented account precise enough that, more than 2.5 centuries later, it would help a very different kind of investigator find the wreck all over again. Justice, such as it was, arrived that October in a Boston courtroom, where Thomas Davis, John Julian, and a handful of other Bellamy crewmen, survivors not of the Wider's wreck itself, but of the Mary Ann, the second ship in Bellamy's flotilla, which had run aground separately that same night, and whose crew of 7 had lived through the storm largely intact, stood trial for piracy. The proceedings turned, as pirate trials of the era frequently did, on a single crucial legal distinction. Had a man joined the pirate crew willingly, or had he been forced? Thomas Davis argued, and the court ultimately accepted, that he had been taken against his will from a captured vessel and kept aboard specifically for his carpentry skills, a defense supported by testimony from other crew members and consistent with well-documented pirate practice of forcibly retaining tradesmen. He was acquitted and released. John Julian's fate is where the historical record grows frustratingly thin, and where a responsible account has to say plainly, "We don't fully know." Some sources suggest he was deemed too young to stand trial as an adult and was instead sold into slavery, a genuinely plausible and grimly consistent outcome given the racial realities of colonial Massachusetts in 1717, where a young man of African and indigenous descent, however skilled, however clearly a forced or at minimum ambiguous participant in Bellamy's crew, faced a legal system that offered him none of the protections a white defendant like Davis could invoke. Other, less certain traditions place a man possibly matching his description later in Massachusetts records, under different circumstances entirely. Historians researching the Wider's crew have been honest about the limits of what the documentary record actually supports here, and so will this account. John Julian survived a storm that killed 144 men around him, piloted a doomed ship with real skill through conditions that gave him no realistic chance of success, and then largely disappears from the reliable historical record, which is, In its own quiet way, its own kind of tragedy, a life that mattered enormously for one catastrophic night, and then simply stopped being written down. It's worth pausing on the specific mechanism of death that claimed most of the 144 men who didn't survive that night, because it connects directly back to everything this evening has already asked you to sit with: the cold. Water in the low 40s Fahrenheit, which is a reasonable estimate for coastal Massachusetts waters in late April, produces incapacitating hypothermia in a conscious, struggling person within a window that modern cold water survival research places at somewhere between 15 minutes and an hour, depending on body size, clothing, and how hard the person is working to stay afloat. A window drastically shortened by exactly the kind of exhausting, panicked swimming a man would do, trying to reach a shore he could sometimes see and never quite reach through breaking surf. Loss of fine motor control comes first, then confusion, then a creeping, dangerous euphoria that cold water drowning survivors have described in eerily consistent terms across multiple documented accounts from more recent maritime disasters. The body's own physiology working actively against a swimmer's judgment in the final minutes. For most of the Wider's crew, in other words, the storm didn't so much drown them as it disabled them, and the water finished what the cold started. It is a genuinely difficult death, and it is worth naming plainly rather than glossing past, because the men who died that night, English, Dutch, French, Mosquito, and African, forced men and volunteers alike, bound together by nothing more permanent than a set of written articles and a captain most of them seem to have genuinely respected, deserve at least that much honesty from anyone telling their story 200 and some years later. For 267 years, the Wider stayed exactly where the storm left her, broken across the seafloor, a few hundred yards off a beach that had, by then, long since become an ordinary stretch of Cape Cod coastline. Its violent history mostly reduced to local legend and the kind of half-remembered ghost stories that attach themselves to any place where a lot of people died badly and quickly. That changed in the summer of 1984, when an underwater explorer named Barry Clifford, working from Cyprian Southac's original recovery reports and charts, the same documents drafted in the panicked days immediately after the wreck, more than 2.5 centuries earlier, located and began excavating a wreck site roughly matching Southac's described position. What Clifford's team found over the following months and years of careful excavation settled a question that might otherwise have remained permanently open. Was this actually the Wider, or simply one of the countless other wrecks littering this same treacherous stretch of coast? The answer arrived in the unglamorous definitive form of a ship's bell, recovered from the wreck site and cast, unmistakably, with the words, "The Wider Galley 1716, the year of her construction," cast directly into bronze by a shipbuilder who had no way of knowing his work would eventually settle a historical mystery 268 years later. It remains, to date, the only confirmed and fully authenticated pirate shipwreck ever discovered anywhere in the world, a distinction that sounds almost surprising, given how thoroughly piracy has saturated popular imagination. Proof that even the most legendary era of maritime history left behind astonishingly little in the way of hard physical evidence, and that most of what people think they know about pirate ships comes from stories, not artifacts. The excavation has, in the decades since, recovered an extraordinary quantity of material, more than 200,000 individual artifacts by some counts, including cannons, cutlasses, navigational instruments, thousands of coins from a dozen different nations, reflecting Bellamy's year of prizes, taken across multiple trade routes, and, in a detail that connects directly back to the coldest, most ordinary part of tonight's story, hammock hooks, the exact iron fittings that would have held men like the ones aboard that night, suspended above the same cold bilgewater described earlier this evening, recovered intact, from a ship that sank in under an hour, and preserved by nearly 3 centuries of cold Atlantic sand. Many of these artifacts are on public display today at a museum in West Yarmouth, Massachusetts, and the excavation continues, periodically, to this day. New sections of the wreck, still occasionally yielding fresh finds even now, 300 and some years after that April night. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that it was cold water, in the end, that both killed most of the Wider's crew and preserved the clearest physical evidence we have of how pirates actually lived. The hammock hooks, the personal effects, the ordinary tools of an ordinary shipboard life, kept intact for centuries by the same frigid Atlantic that made that life so hard to survive in the first place. Samuel Bellamy did not live to see any of it. He went down with his ship, one name among 144, in water that gave him no more mercy than it gave the forced men and the volunteers sailing under him, which is, in its own bleak way, a kind of fairness that the written articles he sailed under, for all their genuine democratic spirit, could never have promised him. The sea, unlike the crew, didn't take a vote. Bellamy's crew never got the chance to fear that storm before it arrived. You have that chance tonight, 4 hours from now, when the bell calls you back up to the one place aboard this ship where the cold isn't something you endure lying still. It's something you fight, standing up, in the open air, for 4 hours at a stretch. The bell finds you again, and this time it's not the berth deck waiting on the other side of it. It's the open deck, and the open deck in April, in these latitudes, at 2 in the morning, is a genuinely different category of cold than anything below decks has prepared you for. You feel it first as a kind of pressure, a full-body clench against wind that's been building steadily out of the northeast since sundown, carrying with it a fine, stinging spray thrown up off wave crests and driven sideways across the deck by gusts strong enough to lean into. This is the wind chill effect, though nobody aboard this ship in 1717 has that term for it. They simply know, from hard experience, that a cold night with wind cuts through clothing far more viciously than the same temperature does in still air, and that standing watch in a gale is a fundamentally more punishing experience than the thermometer reading alone would suggest. Modern meteorology would eventually quantify exactly how much worse. A genuine air temperature hovering just above freezing, combined with sustained winds strong enough to push a ship under full sail, can produce an effective chill on exposed skin, equivalent to temperatures 10, 15, even 20 degrees colder. You don't need the number, you just need the first 90 seconds on deck to understand it in your bones. Rusk is beside you again. The watch rotation has kept you paired more often than not these past weeks, whether by the quartermaster's design or simple chance. And neither of you says much as you take up position near the weather rail, eyes adjusting slowly to a darkness broken only by a sliver of moon fighting through scudding cloud. Your job for the next 4 hours is deceptively simple to describe and genuinely brutal to perform. Watch the horizon for other ships, tend the sails as ordered, and stay alert enough to respond instantly if the weather worsens or a hazard appears, all while your body's core temperature works steadily, hour by hour, toward the kind of cold that starts to compromise judgment before it ever compromises consciousness. The old hands have a phrase for what happens to a green watchstander somewhere around hour 3 of a cold night watch, and it isn't kind. They call it going stupid with the cold, and it's a real, physiologically grounded phenomenon rather than simple sailor's exaggeration. Mild hypothermia's earliest effects aren't dramatic, no collapse, no obvious crisis, just a slow fraying at the edges of attention, slower reaction times, small lapses in judgment that would be inconsequential on a warm afternoon and can be fatal on a pitching deck in the dark. Every experienced pirate quartermaster knew this, whether or not he had the modern vocabulary for it, which is exactly why the watch bill mattered as much as it did, and why a captain who ran his crew ragged with insufficient rotation was, in a very direct sense, gambling with the ship's safety as much as with his men's comfort. Somewhere in the second hour, the order comes down to shorten sail before the wind builds further, and that means men going aloft, climbing the ratlines up into the rigging itself, out along the yards, to hand and furl canvas by touch, in conditions that have made the ropes themselves treacherous. This is where the cold stops being merely uncomfortable and starts being genuinely dangerous in a new way. The standing and running rigging of a ship sailing these latitudes in near-freezing spray accumulates a fine coating of ice with startling speed, turning lines that a topman would ordinarily grip with total confidence into something closer to climbing a frozen fence rail 40 feet above a pitching deck. Russ goes up with the others. A sailmaker's mate is exactly the hand you want aloft when canvas needs handling under pressure, forced man or not, and he's proven himself capable enough in 6 weeks that nobody questions sending him. You watch from the deck, doing what you can with the lines below, and you notice the specific, careful way the top men are moving tonight, testing each handhold before committing weight to it, keeping 3 points of contact wherever possible, the instinctive caution of men who know exactly what a slip means in these conditions and have seen, more than once between them, what happens when someone doesn't test the ice-slicked line before trusting it. Frostbite aboard sailing ships of this era was common enough to be treated by ship surgeons as a routine, if serious, watch-related injury, rather than some rare catastrophe. Period naval and merchant marine medical records reference it consistently across northern voyages, particularly affecting fingers, toes, ears, and the exposed tip of the nose, the extremities the body sacrifices first, as it constricts blood flow toward the vital organs in a desperate bid to protect core temperature. The mechanism is simple and brutal. Prolonged exposure to cold, worsened dramatically by wind and by wet hands gripping icy rope, causes blood vessels in the extremities to constrict so severely that the tissue itself begins to freeze, ice crystals forming between and eventually within the cells. Mild cases presented as numbness and a waxy pallor to the skin. Severe cases, left untreated or exposed too long, could progress to permanent tissue damage, requiring amputation of fingers or toes, a documented and far from rare outcome on northern voyages of the period, whether pirate, naval, or merchant. You watch Rusk's hands specifically, once he's back down and the sails secured, because a sailmaker's hands are his entire livelihood, in a way that matters more than almost anyone else's aboard. A lost finger doesn't just cost Rusk comfort, it costs him the precise, practiced dexterity that makes him valuable enough to have been forced aboard in the first place, rather than simply left ashore. He flexes his fingers in the dark, working feeling back into them, and you notice him wince at something in his right hand before he catches you watching and shakes it off with a small, deliberately unbothered gesture. Neither of you says anything about it yet. There's still 2 hours left on this watch, and worrying uses breath you're both trying to conserve. By the top of the 3rd hour, the worst post on the entire ship tonight belongs to whoever's drawn masthead lookout, perched on a small platform partway up the mainmast, fully exposed to wind that's stronger and colder the higher you climb, with no rigging work to keep the blood moving, just standing and watching and standing and watching, scanning a horizon that tonight offers nothing but darkness and whitecaps for as far as the moon lets you see. Most crews, pirate vessels included, rotated this specific post more frequently than the standard watch rotation, precisely because of how much faster the cold worked on a stationary man than on hands actively hauling line. A documented practical accommodation, even on ships that were otherwise notoriously indifferent to crew comfort. Tonight it's a boy named Peter Coyle up there, no more than 14 by his own reckoning, though nobody aboard, including Coyle himself, is entirely certain of his exact age, not an uncommon uncertainty for a ship's boy of this era, many of whom came from backgrounds where birth records were never kept in the first place. He came aboard as cabin boy on the same captured merchantman that yielded Rusk, too young by any reasonable measure to have been forced in the same sense as the grown men, but too useful, small, quick, good at heights, to be put ashore either, and the quartermaster settled him with a partial share and light duties that have, over the weeks, grown considerably less light. Rusk has taken a kind of unofficial responsibility for him, the way an older hand sometimes does for the youngest aboard, without either of them ever formally acknowledging the arrangement. An extra half ration passed over without comment, a spare bit of canvas cut down into something closer to a proper coat, a low word of instruction on how to wrap his hands against the mast's ice-slicked ratlines. A hail comes down from Coyle's post partway through the watch. Not an alarm, just information, the ordinary traffic of a ship at sea, reporting that the ice building on the weather shrouds has gotten thick enough that he can hear it cracking and shifting with every roll of the ship, a sound he describes, when he's back on deck at watch's end, as being like the rigging itself was groaning in pain. It's the kind of detail that would have meant nothing to you 3 weeks ago and means quite a lot now. Ice accumulation on rigging wasn't just uncomfortable for the men working it, it added real, measurable weight aloft, weight that could affect a ship's stability in exactly the wrong direction during exactly the kind of weather that produces it in the first place. A compounding danger that period sailors understood empirically, through hard experience, decades before anyone could have explained the physics of it in formal terms. It's near the end of the watch, with the eastern sky still hours from showing any hint of grey, that Rusk finally admits the hand is worse than he let on. He stopped trying to hide it by then. There's no real use in pretending once the numbness has spread from his fingertips down through his knuckles, and once the skin across 2 fingers has gone the waxy, yellow-white color that every hand aboard, including you, has been trained by hard shipboard experience to recognize on sight. You get him below before the watch even formally ends, trading a word with the man standing next post over who covers the gap without complaint, because that's simply what you do for a shipmate showing early frostbite. The alternative, letting pride or duty keep a man standing, exposed a moment longer than necessary, is how minor frostnip becomes the kind of frostbite that costs fingers. The ship's surgeon, a genuine one this voyage, a Scotsman named Alexander Kerr, who'd been taken off a captured vessel some months back and, unlike most forced tradesmen, had actually elected to sign the articles once he saw how a pirate crew's compensation for injury compared to what a Royal Navy surgeon's mate could expect, treats the injury with the standard remedy of the era, gradual rewarming, not the rapid heat a modern instinct might reach for, since period medical experience, however imperfectly explained in theoretical terms, had already taught practitioners that fast rewarming of frozen tissue did more damage than slow. Kerr wraps the hand, tells Rusk plainly that he's caught it early enough that he'll likely keep full use of both fingers, and sends him to sleep it off in a hammock, that for tonight at least, nobody argues about him claiming near the small, contained warmth of the surgeon's own lamp. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the kind of detail that tells you something true about how pirate crews actually organized themselves around exactly this kind of hardship. The written articles that governed most Golden Age pirate companies didn't just divide plunder. They typically included a specific, itemized compensation scale for injuries sustained in the ship's service, sums set aside from the company's total plunder before the ordinary shares were even divided. Surviving copies of pirate articles from this era, including sets historians have reconstructed from trial testimony, list compensation for the loss of a right arm, a left arm, a right leg, a left leg, an eye, a finger, a systematic, pre-agreed schedule of what the company as a whole owed a man who was maimed in its collective service. It's not clear from the surviving fragments whether frostbite injury short of actual amputation was formally covered under these schedules, and a responsible account has to admit that uncertainty rather than claim more precision than the record supports. But the underlying principle, that a hand lost or damaged in the ship's service was the whole company's debt to pay, not simply the injured man's private misfortune, was real, documented, and about as close to organized workers' compensation as existed anywhere in the Atlantic world of 1717, on a merchant deck or a naval one, let alone a pirate deck flying a black flag. There's a myth worth clearing up here, because it's one of the most persistent pieces of folk wisdom about cold weather survival, and it's also, medically speaking, backwards. The rum ration, grog, watered or otherwise, doled out with some regularity aboard most pirate and naval vessels of the period, was widely believed by sailors to be a genuine defense against cold, a warming draught to fortify a man before a hard watch. It does, briefly, produce a real sensation of warmth, as alcohol dilates the blood vessels near the skin's surface, flooding your extremities with a rush of blood that feels, for a few minutes, unmistakably like heat. What it's actually doing is the opposite of helpful. That surface blood flow accelerates heat loss to the surrounding cold air, and the alcohol simultaneously dulls the very shivering reflex and the mental alertness a person needs to recognize early dangerous cold before it progresses. Modern cold water and cold weather survival guidance is explicit and consistent on this exact point, precisely because so many well-intentioned people, across so many centuries, have made the same understandable, dangerous mistake Rusk's crewmates were making tonight. Believing a warm feeling in their chest meant genuine protection against a cold that, in truth, alcohol was quietly making worse. None of which stopped the ration from being issued, or from being welcomed, because a felt sensation of warmth mattered to morale, in a way that a surgeon's cautionary lecture rarely could compete with, and because the men handing it out and drinking it had no access to the physiological explanation that would come centuries later. It's one of the small, human contradictions of shipboard life in this era, a genuine comfort and a genuine hazard, distributed nightly, and nobody aboard with the knowledge to tell you which one it actually was. By the time 8 bells finally sounds, ending the watch, the eastern horizon has gone from black to the deep, bruised grey that precedes actual dawn by the better part of an hour, and every hand coming off duty moves with the particular, stiff-legged gait of men who've spent 4 hours fighting cold with nothing but motion and stubbornness. You find Coyle at the base of the mainmast, released from his lookout post at last, and you notice, the way you've started noticing things about the people around you these past weeks, that his hands are shaking not entirely from cold. Rusk, hand bandaged, catches the same thing, and without making any particular show of it, walks the boy below himself, gets him settled, and stays a few minutes past, when he could reasonably have gone to his own rest. The same quiet, unspoken kindness that's been passed to you more than once these past 6 weeks, now moving one link further down the chain. That's the shape hope takes out here, most nights, not rescue, not warmth arriving from anywhere outside the ship itself. Just one cold, exhausted man making sure the next one gets below safely, because nobody else is going to do it, and because, whatever else piracy is, whatever violence and desperation brought each of these men aboard, the articles you signed 6 weeks ago made you responsible for each other in a way that turned out, against every expectation you'd walked aboard with, to actually mean something. By your 3rd week standing this same rotation, you've built something like a system, the way anybody eventually does, when a hardship repeats often enough to stop feeling like an emergency and start feeling like simply the shape of your life. You've learned to layer wool against your skin first, never linen, because linen holds moisture against you the way wool never quite does. You've learned to grease your hands with whatever slush or tallow the galley can spare before a cold watch, an old sailor's trick against chapping and early frostnip that shows up in enough period accounts, from Royal Navy logs to merchant captains' private journals, to count as genuine common practice rather than folk invention. You've learned which section of the weather rail blocks the worst of the spray, and which one only looks like it does, a piece of knowledge Rusk handed you without comment your 2nd week aboard, the kind of small inheritance that passes silently from an experienced hand to a newer one on every ship that's ever sailed cold water. None of it makes the watch warm, all of it makes the watch survivable, which on a night like tonight is the only distinction that actually matters. Oilskins were the other real defense against this particular cold, though oilskin in 1717 meant something considerably cruder than the word suggests to modern ears. Canvas or heavy linen treated with linseed oil or tar, worked in by hand until the fabric turned stiff, dark, and reasonably water-resistant. Not waterproof, not by any modern standard, but genuinely better than untreated cloth against driving spray and rain. Sailors of the period, pirate and otherwise, called this tarred cloth, or simply their tarpaulins, a term that eventually gave English the slang word tar itself as a nickname for an ordinary sailor. Making and maintaining a set of tarred watch gear was skilled, unglamorous work, and it's exactly the sort of task that fell to men like Rusk between watches. One more quiet way a sailmaker's mate's forced skills ended up protecting the very crew that had forced him aboard in the first place. An irony neither he nor you have ever quite found the right moment to say out loud. Documented accounts from Royal Navy logs of the same general era describe ships operating in North Atlantic winter conditions, accumulating ice on deck, thick enough that crews were assigned specifically to chip and clear it with axes and mauls, a task that could occupy hands for hours and that carried its own real danger, a deck coated in ice underfoot, on a rolling ship, being exactly the kind of surface that turns an ordinary task into a broken limb or a man over the side in a single mistimed step. Pirate vessels operating this same stretch of coast faced identical conditions and, where the logs and depositions survive to tell us anything at all, adopted identical solutions, because there was no pirate alternative to physics. Ice on a mast or a deck behaved the same way whether the flag flying above it was a nation's colors or a black one. 4 more hours, and the watch turns over again, and somewhere in that turning over is the only real rhythm this voyage offers. Cold, then less cold, then cold again, on a schedule that doesn't care what the calendar says or how many weeks you've already survived it. Tonight, though, as you finally climb below with Rusk's bandaged hand tucked carefully against his chest, the quartermaster passes word down the line that's new. Course is changing, not south, toward warmer water and easier duty, the way you might have hoped. North, toward Newfoundland and toward a stretch of coast where pirate captains have been wintering, raiding, and occasionally building small floating empires out of nothing but cold water and nerve for more than 100 years before you ever signed your name to a set of articles. The harbour at Harbour Grace, Newfoundland, froze solid most winters, and in the winter of 1612 it held something considerably stranger than the usual handful of fishing shallops laid up for the season. It held a fleet, by some contemporary estimates as many as 10 armed vessels, crewed by nearly 1,000 men, riding at anchor in a stretch of coastline so remote that the nearest thing resembling an English government presence was a small, struggling colony 2 days' sail away that had no realistic hope of doing anything about it. This is the story of Peter Easton, the privateer turned pirate, who built, for a handful of astonishing years, something close to an actual kingdom out of frozen water, forced fishermen, and the simple fact that nobody in a position of authority was close enough, or strong enough, to stop him. Easton's career began the way a great many pirate careers of this earlier generation did, legally, with the Crown's own blessing. He was, by the 1590s, an English privateer sailing under letters of marque issued during the long war between England and Spain, official government licenses that authorized a private captain to attack and plunder enemy shipping, a legal fiction that separated privateering from outright piracy by nothing more than a signed document and a national flag. Easton served with genuine distinction in this capacity, reportedly rising to command squadrons defending English shipping and even participating in operations against Spanish forces during the war's later years. It was, for a man of his skills and temperament, a legitimate and reasonably respectable career. Then, in 1604, the war ended. James I, newly on the English throne following Elizabeth's death the year before, negotiated peace with Spain, and with that peace, the entire legal apparatus that had employed men like Easton simply evaporated. Letters of marque became worthless overnight. Ships that had operated as licensed privateers were suddenly told to stand down. Their crews owed back wages. The Crown showed little urgency about actually paying. Their captains facing a stark choice between abandoning the only trade most of them had ever known or continuing to do exactly what they'd always done, minus the legal cover. A remarkable number chose the second option, and the resulting wave of newly illegal privateers turned pirates is one of the most consistent, well-documented patterns historians point to when explaining where an entire generation of Golden Age piracy's predecessors actually came from. Not romantic outlaws from the start, but state-sponsored naval veterans whose government simply stopped needing them and never bothered disarming them. Easton did not simply continue raiding on his own account. He built something larger and considerably more organized than the loose, opportunistic bands most pirate captains commanded. Operating first out of Ireland's southern coast, he absorbed smaller pirate crews into his own command, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through simple superior force, until by the later years of the decade, he commanded what contemporary accounts describe, with some consistency across multiple independent sources, as a genuine fleet. Estimates range from 10 to as many as 40 vessels depending on the year and the source, crewed by anywhere from 1 to 2,500 men at his peak. Historians treat the higher end of these figures with appropriate caution, since period estimates of enemy strength were prone to exaggeration in both directions, depending on who was doing the counting and why. But even the conservative estimates describe an operation of a scale almost unmatched by any single pirate commander of the entire Golden Age that followed him. Bartholomew Roberts's famously large crews numbered in the low hundreds, not thousands. What Easton needed to sustain a fleet of that size was two things almost impossible to find together anywhere else in the Atlantic world of the period: a reliable, renewable source of prizes, and a base remote enough that no navy could realistically reach him in force. Newfoundland offered both, for reasons rooted directly in the geography and economy of the fishery itself. Every summer, hundreds of English, French, Portuguese, and Basque fishing vessels crossed the Atlantic to work the astonishingly rich cod grounds off Newfoundland's coast, arriving lightly armed. Fishing ships had no need to carry the guns a merchantman running valuable cargo through pirate-infested waters would, and departing in autumn, heavily laden with salted fish, worth real money in European markets. To a pirate fleet, this seasonal migration was, in effect, a renewable resource. Undefended ships, predictable timing, and a product valuable enough to be worth stealing outright, rather than needing to be fenced through some complicated black market first. The remoteness that protected fishing crews from casual raiders for most of the year worked just as effectively in Easton's favor once he decided to winter there, rather than simply raid and retreat to warmer waters, the way most pirates of any era preferred. Newfoundland in winter was, and remains, a genuinely brutal environment. Natural harbors freezing over, temperatures dropping well below anything Caribbean-based pirate crews of the later Golden Age would ever have to contend with, daylight hours shrinking to a handful per day through the darkest months. But a harbor frozen and isolated from easy naval access was also a harbor no English warship was going to sail into uninvited, and Easton, unlike almost every pirate captain who came after him in the more famous Caribbean theater of piracy's golden decades, made that trade deliberately, genuine physical hardship in exchange for genuine physical safety from pursuit. Wintering an entire pirate fleet in Newfoundland required infrastructure that no single ship, however well provisioned, could improvise on its own. Easton's crews built shore camps at harbors, including Harbor Grace and Ferryland, rough but functional settlements of huts and storehouses that let several hundred men live ashore through the coldest months, rather than trapped aboard ships frozen fast in harbor ice. A genuine practical improvement over shipboard winter conditions, since a shore hut with a proper fire pit could offer heat in a way that no wooden ship's fire safety rules would ever permit below decks. provisioning depended heavily on exactly the seasonal fishing fleets Easton preyed on. Salted cod, taken in enormous quantity from captured vessels, could be stored through a Newfoundland winter with minimal spoilage, giving Easton's fleet a food security most contemporary pirate operations, dependent on constant raiding for fresh supply, simply couldn't match. He also did something considerably darker and less romantic than the fleet building alone suggests, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than glossed past, in favor of the more colorful details. Easton routinely forced skilled fishermen and shipwrights from captured vessels into his service, not merely taking their cargo, but conscripting the men themselves, sometimes for a single season, sometimes indefinitely, to crew his growing fleet and maintain his ships through the winter months. Contemporary accounts, including the writings of Richard Whitbourne, an English adventurer and naval officer with direct, personal experience of Easton's operation, describe entire fishing crews taken wholesale, their vessels either absorbed into Easton's fleet or stripped and abandoned. This was piracy, functioning less like the small-scale opportunistic robbery most people picture, and more like an occupying force, levying labor and resources from an entire regional economy, because for a few years in the early 1610s, that is essentially what Easton's fleet had become. Whitbourne himself is where this story gets its most direct, personal turning point. Sent to Newfoundland partly to investigate and report on piracy's effect on the fishery, Whitbourne was captured by Easton's fleet in 1611 and held for a period of roughly 11 weeks, not brutalized, by his own later account, but detained, questioned, and made to observe firsthand the scale of the operation he'd been sent to assess. Whitbourne's own writings, published some years later, remain one of the single most valuable surviving primary sources for understanding exactly how Easton's fleet functioned, precisely because Whitbourne had the unusual vantage point of an educated, literate captive with both the motive and the ability to record what he saw in careful detail once he was eventually released. It is a strange kind of historical gift when you think about it. The clearest surviving account of a pirate admiral's winter operation exists because that admiral, for reasons of his own that Whitbourne's account doesn't fully explain, chose to let his most useful potential witness go free rather than silence him. Easton's relationship with Newfoundland's small, struggling English colonies was similarly fraught and similarly one-sided. John Guy's settlement at Cupid's, founded in 1610 as one of England's earliest attempts at permanent Newfoundland colonization, existed only a short sail from waters Easton's fleet effectively controlled, and surviving correspondence from the colony describes a relationship defined by fear and forced accommodation rather than open conflict. The colonists, vastly outnumbered and entirely undefended against a force of Easton's scale, had little practical choice but to avoid provoking him, trading information and occasionally supplies in exchange for being left largely alone. It's a relationship that tells you something important about what piracy on this scale actually meant for the people living alongside it. Not the swashbuckling confrontation popular imagination tends to picture, but a kind of grim, practical coexistence, an armed and powerful neighbor that legitimate settlers organized their entire behavior around avoiding rather than resisting. Life inside Easton's shore camps, for the conscripted fishermen and sailors who made up the bulk of his winter population, is not documented in anything like the personal, granular detail that later Golden Age pirate voyages sometimes left behind through trial depositions and survivor accounts. What can be reconstructed from the broader context of early 17th century Newfoundland fishing operations and from the few surviving descriptions of similar shore stations built by legitimate fishing crews wintering over in this same period, suggests conditions that were, if anything, more physically punishing than shipboard cold, in some specific respects, even as they solved others. A shore hut could have an open fire, which no wooden ship's hold ever safely could, a genuine improvement, and probably the single biggest reason Easton's crews built camps ashore at all, rather than simply wintering aboard ship, the way later Caribbean-based pirates, operating in a climate that never demanded it, never had to consider. But those same huts, hastily built from local timber by men without proper tools or time, offered only crude insulation against Newfoundland's genuinely severe winter temperatures, routinely dropping into the teens and single digits Fahrenheit and below across the darkest months. Cold, that made the North Atlantic ship cold. This account has already spent 2 full chapters describing look, by comparison, almost survivable. By the mid-1610s, Easton had grown wealthy and powerful enough that the English crown began treating him less as a nuisance to be hanged and more as a problem to be negotiated with. A distinction that tells you something real about the practical limits of naval power in this period, when a fleet the size of a small national navy could operate for years out of a colony England claimed but couldn't actually defend. King James I reportedly offered Easton a formal pardon on more than one occasion, part of a broader royal strategy of the period that offered amnesty to pirates willing to abandon the trade, provided they surrendered their ships and submitted to the Crown's authority. Easton, by most surviving accounts, seriously considered at least one of these offers and ultimately declined it. Accounts differ on his exact reasoning, whether he distrusted the Crown's sincerity, judged the terms unfavorable given how much wealth and power he stood to lose, or simply preferred the independence his fleet already gave him to whatever diminished status a royal pardon would leave him with. What Easton chose instead was, by the standards of pirate careers across the entire era that followed him, almost unheard of, a negotiated, voluntary retirement into legitimate European aristocracy. Around 1614, he sailed his fleet to the Mediterranean and entered the service of Charles Emmanuel I, Duke of Savoy, a ruler apparently unbothered by the source of Easton's considerable accumulated wealth, and quite interested in acquiring both that wealth and the naval expertise that had generated it. Easton was granted lands and, according to multiple period sources, purchased or was granted the title of Marquis, settling into a fortified residence at Villefranche-sur-Mer on the French Riviera coast, living out the remainder of his life in genuine, comfortable, aristocratic retirement, a fate that essentially none of the more famous Golden Age pirates who came 100 years after him, Bellamy included, would ever come close to matching. There is something worth sitting with in that ending, and it isn't a comfortable something. Peter Easton spent years extracting labor, ships, and provisions from forced fishermen, wintering in Newfoundland's genuine, bone-deep cold, and he alone among them walked away from the whole enterprise into a warm Mediterranean retirement, funded directly by that extraction. The men he conscripted, the fishermen taken from Bristol and Devon and Basque country, forced to crew his ships and build his shore camps through winters considerably colder than anything the Wider's crew would face a century later, mostly disappear from the record entirely once Easton's fleet dissolves, their individual fates as unrecorded as most forced men's fates tend to be across the entire history of piracy. Easton's own story survives in exceptional, unusual detail precisely because he was the one man in it, wealthy and powerful enough to leave paper trails wherever he went. Theirs survive only in the negative space around his. The anonymous labor a pirate admiral's comfortable retirement was quietly built on. Easton's departure did not end piracy in Newfoundland waters, though it did mark something close to the end of that specific model. The pirate admiral, commanding a fleet large enough to function as a shadow government over an entire colonial fishery. His near contemporary, Henry Mainwaring, followed a broadly similar arc a few years later. Another former privateer turned pirate, another commander who built a substantial fleet operating partly out of Newfoundland, and another man who ultimately accepted a royal pardon rather than Easton's path into foreign aristocracy, going on to a legitimate career as a naval officer, member of parliament, and, in a detail that has its own dry irony, an author of one of the era's most detailed technical works on suppressing piracy, drawing directly on his own considerable first-hand expertise in committing it. Between them, Easton and Mainwaring represent the two exit ramps available to a successful pirate admiral of this earlier generation. Buy your way into a foreign title, or trade your expertise back to the crown that outlawed you in the first place. Neither path was available to the vast majority of pirates who followed a century later, operating in a Caribbean legal and political environment that had hardened considerably against exactly this kind of negotiated amnesty. Newfoundland itself kept Easton's memory alive in the particular way frontier places tend to keep pirates alive, not through careful archival preservation, but through treasure legend, embellished steadily across 3 centuries of retelling, until fact and folklore became genuinely difficult to separate. Local tradition around Harbour Grace and nearby Kelly's Island has for generations held that Easton buried a portion of his considerable plunder somewhere along this stretch of coast before departing for Savoy, a story with no surviving documentary support whatsoever, but with exactly the durability such stories always seem to have, passed down through Newfoundland communities as a piece of genuine local heritage, regardless of whether a single shovelful of that supposed treasure has ever actually been found. It's worth naming this plainly as legend rather than history, the same way this account has tried to flag every disputed or embellished detail across tonight's journey. But it's also worth admitting that the legend persists precisely because Easton's real, documented career was already so improbable that a buried fortune barely even registers as the strangest thing about him. What lingers, more than the treasure legend, is the specific, physical fact of what Easton's operation actually required to function. Hundreds of men, most of them there against their will, living through genuine Newfoundland winters in shore huts and frozen-in ships, keeping a fleet of 10 to 40 vessels provisioned and seaworthy through cold that makes the North Atlantic conditions the Wider's crew faced look almost temperate by comparison. Easton himself likely spent those same winters in considerably better shelter than his conscripted fishermen did. Command tends to arrange itself that way, in piracy as in every other hierarchy humans have ever built. But even a pirate admiral's comparative comfort in a Newfoundland winter camp was a far cry from the Mediterranean warmth waiting for him at the end of this story. Wealth, it turns out, bought Easton an exit from the cold. It never once made the cold itself any less real for the men who spent their winters inside it. It's worth one final comparison before this story closes, because it sharpens exactly what made Easton's operation so unusual, even among pirate fleets of unusual scale. A century later, Bartholomew Roberts's company would sail with articles that explicitly banned gambling for money aboard ship, required lights and candles extinguished by 8 at night, and mandated that muskets, pistols, and cutlasses be kept clean and ready for service. A written code, voted on and agreed to by the whole company, governing behavior down to fairly minor daily details. No comparable document survives from Easton's fleet, and historians studying his operation generally conclude that none likely existed in the same form. Easton's was less a democratic company operating under mutually agreed articles and more a straightforward, hierarchical military command structure, closer in spirit to a private navy than to the elected captain, shared articles model that would come to define the more famous pirate companies of the following century. That distinction matters for tonight's larger story, because it means the genuine democratic protections this account has already described, the vote, the compensation schedule, the shared risk, were not universal features of pirate life across the whole of its history. They were, in significant part, an innovation of the later Golden Age generation, one that men like Rusk and Coyle, 100 years after Easton retired to his Mediterranean estate, would benefit from in ways the fishermen conscripted into Easton's Newfoundland fleet never had the chance to. Easton lived out his remaining years in Villefranche in genuine comfort, and the historical record, so far as it goes, suggests he died there of natural causes sometime in the 1620s, an ending almost scandalously peaceful by the standards of the trade he'd practiced. It is worth remembering him tonight, not as an isolated curiosity, but as the clearest possible preview of a pattern this account will return to again before the night is through. Piracy's rewards, across 3 centuries of Atlantic history, rarely distributed themselves evenly between the men who commanded the cold and the men who simply endured it. Not every pirate who wintered in cold water got the luxury of choosing when or whether to come in from it. And the next stretch of tonight's story goes back below decks, to the ordinary, unglamorous business of simply staying alive through a season nobody aboard had any say in choosing. The smell reaches you before the sound does, a close, sour, unmistakable smell that has, in the space of about 10 days, turned the forward section of the berth deck into a place the rest of the crew has started calling, half joking and half not, the sick corner, and giving a wide berth whenever duty doesn't require otherwise. You've been aboard long enough now to know the ordinary smells of this ship intimately. Tar, bilge water, wet wool, salt pork going slightly off in its cask, the particular mustiness of canvas that stayed damp too long. This is different, sharper, tinged with something your body recognizes as danger before your mind has fully worked out why. What's spreading through the crowded forward berths isn't the ordinary cough or joint ache that's dogged half the crew since you left warmer water. It's fever, a hard, sustained fever that period ship surgeons across the Atlantic world knew by the grim, practical name ship fever, and that modern medicine has since identified as typhus, a disease carried not by the cold itself, but by body lice, which thrive in exactly the conditions this voyage has been serving up for weeks now: unwashed wool, worn continuously for warmth, close-packed sleeping quarters, and men too cold and too exhausted to spare the effort, washing themselves or their clothing. It's a cruel irony worth sitting with, because it means the very defenses this voyage has spent weeks teaching you against the cold. Layer your wool, keep it on, don't undress for bed, share body heat in close quarters, are precisely the conditions under which typhus spreads fastest and hardest. Warmth-seeking behavior and disease transmission, on a ship like this one, turn out to be almost the same behavior wearing 2 different names, and nobody aboard in 1717 has the germ theory of disease that would let them understand the connection in the terms a modern reader would recognize. What they have instead is grim, empirical observation. Fever seems to spread fastest through the most crowded, least washed parts of the crew, and it seems to get worse the colder and wetter the voyage runs. And that correlation, even without the underlying mechanism, is enough to make Kerr, the ship's surgeon, genuinely worried by the 2nd week of the outbreak. The man everyone calls Old Simon is the first serious case, though nobody aboard would have called him old by any measure except shipboard comparison. He's perhaps 45, ancient by the standards of a crew where most hands, including you, are somewhere in their 20s, and he's sailed under enough captains and enough flags across enough years that the crew has taken to treating his opinion on weather, rigging, and captains alike as close to gospel. He'd signed the articles freely back in the Bahamas after 11 years before the mast on merchant vessels had convinced him a pirate's share beat a merchant sailor's wages by a margin no honest man could argue with. He's been the closest thing to a mentor Coyle has had aboard this ship, besides Rusk, teaching the boy knots and weather reading with the patient, gruff affection of a man who'd buried better instincts than sentimentality years ago and kept this one anyway. Simon takes to his hammock on a Tuesday, complaining of a headache and an ache in his joints he initially, and understandably, mistakes for the ordinary rheumatism that's dogged half the crew for weeks. By Thursday, the fever has him talking in a low, disjointed mutter that isn't quite delirium yet, but is clearly heading there, and Kerr moves him to the small, dedicated sick berth, a cramped space near the surgeon's own quarters, set aside specifically for exactly this purpose. One more piece of shipboard infrastructure that period vessels, pirate and otherwise, generally maintained, even when everything else about the ship's fittings ran spare. Kerr's treatment options, by any modern medical standard, amount to very little. Keep the patient as warm and as clean as circumstances allow, encourage fluids, and wait. because the actual pharmacological tools that might have done more for a raging fever simply didn't exist yet in any form a ship's surgeon of 1717 would have had access to. Rusk sits with Simon more evenings than duty requires, a fact you notice without either of you discussing it directly, the way you've noticed most of the quiet, unofficial kindnesses that have passed between the men of this crew across the past weeks. He doesn't say much while he's there. There isn't much to say to a man drifting in and out of a fever this severe, but he's present. And presence, you're starting to understand, is most of what any of you actually have to offer each other out here. No physicians beyond care, no family, no home to send word to if things go badly. Just the men standing the next watch over, sitting the next hammock across, doing what small, insufficient things they can for each other, because the alternative, doing nothing, out of some misguided instinct towards self-protection, has never once occurred to any of them as a real option. By the second week of the outbreak, Kerr has done everything within his limited power to slow the fever's spread, and most of it centers on a resource this ship, like every ship of the era, never had enough of, even before illness made the shortage worse. Fresh water. The standard remedy against ship fever that period medical thinking actually did understand, even without the germ theory to explain why it worked, was washing. Clothes, bodies, bedding, anything that had been in prolonged contact with a feverish man, and washing meant fresh water, which meant drawing down casks that were already rationed carefully for drinking, all while sailing waters cold enough that the casks themselves had, on the worst nights, begun developing a skin of ice across their surface that had to be broken before anyone could draw from them at all. There is something almost absurd, if you let yourself sit with it, about thirst aboard a ship, surrounded on every side by more water than exists anywhere else on Earth. But seawater is undrinkable. Its salt content actively worsens dehydration, rather than relieving it. A fact sailors of this era understood through hard, repeated experience, even without the physiological explanation. And more than one desperate or poorly informed sailor across the whole history of seafaring learned that lesson the hard way, drinking seawater in genuine thirst and making his condition considerably worse rather than better. Fresh water aboard ship existed only in what the casks held, refilled at whatever port or captured prize allowed it, and in cold weather specifically, those casks brought their own additional misery, water cold enough to ache in your teeth when you drank it, and, on the coldest nights, cold enough to freeze solid near the cask's edges, requiring a hand to chip it loose before the ration could even be measured out. Flux, what a modern reader would recognize as dysentery, though period sailors used the term more loosely to cover a range of severe gastrointestinal illness, moved through the crew alongside the fever that same fortnight, driven by exactly the combination of factors you'd expect: salted, poorly preserved meat, water drawn from casks that weren't always as clean as circumstances demanded, and a crew already weakened by cold, poor sleep, and inadequate diet, with immune systems that had nothing left in reserve to fight off a second serious illness stacked directly on top of the first. Ship's logs and surgeons' records from across the entire age of sail treat flux and fever together as the two great, unglamorous killers of shipboard life, far deadlier, across the full statistical sweep of naval and maritime history, than combat, storm, or shipwreck combined, however much less attention those causes of death get in the stories people tell afterward. Kerr's medical toolkit against all of this amounts to a modest wooden chest of remedies that would strike a modern reader as almost quaint, and it's worth naming a few of them plainly, because the gap between what a period surgeon believed he was doing and what modern medicine now understands he was actually accomplishing is itself a piece of history worth sitting with. Bloodletting remained standard practice for fever across virtually all of European medicine in 1717, grounded in an ancient theory of bodily humors that modern medicine has since discarded entirely. Kerr draws blood from Simon's arm on the second day of his fever, following training and precedent that every surgeon of his generation would have received, with no way of knowing that the practice likely weakened rather than helped a body already fighting a serious infection. Willow bark, brewed into a bitter tea, genuinely did help with fever and pain, containing compounds chemically related to what would, nearly 2 centuries later, become the active ingredient in aspirin. One of the few tools in Kerr's chest that period folk medicine had, largely by empirical trial and error rather than theoretical understanding, actually gotten right. Vinegar, splashed liberally around the sick berth and used to wipe down feverish patients, offered some genuine, mild antiseptic value alongside its intended purpose of combating the era's belief in disease-carrying bad air, a case of an old and mistaken theory, nonetheless producing a practice that did some real, if limited, good. There's a specific, quiet dread that settles over a crew during an outbreak like this one, distinct from the more immediate fear of storm or battle that this account has already spent considerable time describing. It's slower, and in some ways harder to carry, because there's no watch bell marking its end, no clear moment when the danger has passed and the crew can stand down. Sailors of this era carried their own superstitions about it, the same instinct for pattern and omen that governed so much of shipboard belief, a widespread, though inconsistently documented notion that deaths at sea came in threes, that a ship marked by one serious death was owed 2 more before the fever, the curse, or whatever unnamed force sailors blamed for their misfortune would finally release its grip. It isn't a belief grounded in anything a modern reader would recognize as evidence, and this account won't pretend otherwise, but it's a real, human response to genuine helplessness, a way of imposing some shape, however superstitious, onto a danger that otherwise offers no shape at all, just a slow, unpredictable spread through a crowded, cold, close-packed crew with no way of knowing in advance who it will take next. Coyle falls sick in the 3rd week, and for 2 days it's genuinely unclear which way it will go. He's 14, small for his age, even by the standards of a period where diets and childhoods were harder than most modern readers can easily picture. And the fever hits him with a severity that has Kerr moving him into the sick berth alongside Simon, rather than leaving him in the general berth deck, not out of any special favor, but because a body that young and that small has less reserve to draw on than a grown man's does, and Kerr, whatever his other limitations, knows that much from experience, even without a modern pediatric medical framework to formalize it. Rusk barely leaves the sick berth those 2 days, trading watches with anyone willing to cover for him, sitting with the boy through a fever that has him shaking and incoherent by the 2nd night, in exactly the way you'd expect the man who spent 6 weeks quietly looking out for him to behave, without either of them ever having formally called it that. You bring what small comforts you can find, a spare blanket someone's willing to part with, water carefully warmed as much as the fire restrictions allow, which isn't much, using a small heated stone wrapped in cloth that Kerr keeps for exactly this purpose. It isn't medicine, it's presence again, the same insufficient, essential thing this entire crew keeps offering each other, because it's genuinely all there is to offer. On the 3rd morning, Coyle's fever breaks. It happens the way fevers of this era typically resolved, when they resolved favorably at all. Not a dramatic recovery, just a slow, exhausted return to something like normal temperature. A boy who's lost visible weight in 3 days, but is asking, in a thin, cracked voice, whether he's missed his watch rotation, which gets the first genuine laugh out of Rusk that anyone's heard in days. He hasn't. Nobody expected him to stand it, and nobody's going to make him stand it for at least another week. Quartermaster's orders, delivered with the same gruff, unsentimental practicality that governs most of this ship's genuine kindnesses. Old Simon does not recover. He dies on the same morning Coyle's fever breaks, a coincidence of timing that nobody aboard finds any particular meaning in beyond the plain, exhausting fact of it. Grief and relief, arriving within hours of each other, the way they often do on a ship where illness moves through a crowded, cold, close-packed crew without any particular respect for narrative tidiness. Kerr records the death plainly in whatever rough log he keeps, and word passes through the ship the way news always does, below decks, hand to hand, watch to watch, until everyone aboard knows before the day is out that old Simon, who taught half the ship's younger hands to read weather and knots alike, is gone. Burial at sea aboard a pirate vessel followed a form that owed more to naval and merchant tradition than to any specifically pirate innovation, there being, after all, no particular reason for men who'd spent their whole working lives at sea before turning pirate to reinvent a ritual that already served its purpose well enough. Simon's body, sewn into a length of his own worn canvas by Rusk's careful hand, a sailmaker's final practical service to a shipmate, and one Rusk performs without being asked, the needle moving with the same steady competence it brings to every other piece of canvas aboard this ship, is brought to the weather rail as the crew gathers, hats off despite the cold, in the kind of silence that a genuinely diverse, largely irreligious pirate crew of forced men and volunteers alike can still produce when the moment calls for it. There's no clergyman aboard, there rarely was on any pirate vessel of the era, so the quartermaster reads a few words instead. Not scripture exactly, more a plain accounting of a life. What ship he'd sailed, how long he'd served, what he was owed. Then the body goes over, into water cold enough that, had the day gone differently, it might have claimed any one of you the same way it's claiming Simon now, and the ship sails on, because a ship at sea has no capacity to stop and grieve properly. And everyone aboard already knows this, and does what genuine grieving they can do, standing at a rail for the length of a few sentences, before duty calls them back to whatever the day still requires of them. What happens to Simon's share is worth knowing, because it's another small, concrete example of exactly the kind of structural decency this account keeps returning to, and it deserves to be named as clearly as the grimmer details this evening has already covered. Under the articles this crew sailed under, broadly consistent with surviving examples from other Golden Age pirate companies, a dead man's share of accumulated plunder didn't simply vanish into the company's general pool or get quietly absorbed by the captain. It was recorded, set aside, and, where a man had named kin or a known home port, made available to be claimed or forwarded on his behalf, an imperfect and unevenly enforced system by any modern standard, dependent on a crew's honesty and a captain's diligence in a trade that gave both plenty of opportunity to simply not bother. But the principle existed and was documented often enough across surviving articles and trial testimony that historians treat it as a genuine, if inconsistently applied, feature of pirate company life. One more piece of evidence that a pirate crew, whatever its violence and desperation, generally understood itself as owing something concrete to its own dead, rather than simply moving on and forgetting them the moment they went over the rail. Simon, as it happens, had no family anyone aboard knew of to send his share toward. A common enough situation among men who'd spent a working lifetime at sea, drifting from port to port and ship to ship, without ever quite settling long enough to build the kind of shoreside attachments that survive a man's death. His share, by the quartermaster's decision and without any particular ceremony, gets folded into a small fund the ship maintains for exactly this circumstance, money set aside, in theory, for the eventual benefit of the crew's own injured or aging hands, a rough, informal precursor to the kind of mutual aid a modern reader might recognize from considerably later labor history, existing here in miniature, on a pirate ship, in 1717, built out of nothing more than the collective decision of men who'd voted their own captain into office and saw no particular reason their care for each other should stop at the moment one of them died. You think about this, the night after Simon's burial, lying in your hammock, with Rusk quiet beside you and Coyle, still weak but recovering, slung nearby, in the sick berth's more comfortable quarters, for at least another few days. The cold hasn't gotten any less real for any of this. Simon is still dead, and the water outside the hull is still cold enough to have killed him, just as effectively as the fever did, had circumstances gone even slightly differently. But there's something in the quiet, unglamorous machinery of how this crew handles its own losses, the recorded share, the small fund, the careful stitching of a burial shroud by a man who barely knew the deceased beyond 6 weeks of shared watches. That feels, even now, like it's worth something. Not warmth, exactly, but its closest available substitute, out here, where warmth itself is mostly just a memory everyone aboard is working from. By the following week, the fever has largely burned itself out through the crew, the way these outbreaks tended to, having run through the men most vulnerable to it, and left the rest with whatever resistance a body builds from surviving a first exposure. Kerr counts the final toll in his log with the same plain, unsentimental precision he's brought to every entry this voyage. 1 death, 4 serious cases besides Simon and Coyle, a dozen milder ones that resolved on their own within days. It is, by the grim actuarial standards of shipboard life in this era, a comparatively fortunate outcome. Plenty of documented voyages across the period lost far more than 1 man to a serious fever outbreak, and Kerr, for all his limited tools, seems to know it, the closest thing to satisfaction crossing his face when he finally closes the log on the matter and turns his attention back to the ordinary business of a ship's daily complaints. Coyle is back on light duty within the week, thinner than before but recognizably himself, already needling Rusk about when he'll be cleared for a proper watch again. The cold hasn't changed, the ship hasn't changed, but something in the crew has settled, the particular, hard-won calm that comes from having faced a genuine danger together and, mostly, come through it. Somewhere on the other side of this same cold Atlantic, another pirate crew was learning an almost identical lesson about what the sea takes and what a company's articles can, and can't, give back. Though theirs would play out not in a sick berth, but in a harbour full of undefended fishing boats. June 21st, 1720, Trepassey Harbour, Newfoundland. 22 English fishing vessels rode at anchor that morning alongside roughly 150 more belonging to French, Portuguese and other nations, working the same rich cod grounds Peter Easton's fleet had exploited a century earlier. None of them were armed for war. None of their crews expected trouble on an ordinary June morning in a harbour that had, for generations, been simply a place fish got caught and salted, not a battlefield. Then, out of the fog, came a ship flying black colours, beating drums, sounding trumpets, and firing her guns into the empty air with a deliberate, theatrical fury that had nothing to do with actual combat, and everything to do with making sure every man watching from those 170-odd vessels understood, in the space of about 90 seconds, exactly how completely and how immediately his morning had just gone wrong. This is the story of Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate captain of the entire Golden Age, by nearly every measurable standard historians use, and of the single morning that turned a remote Newfoundland fishing harbour into one of the most one-sided routes in the whole of piracy's recorded history. Roberts was, before any of this, an unlikely candidate for pirate legend. Born John Roberts in Wales around 1682, he adopted Bartholomew only after taking up command, for reasons the record doesn't fully explain. He spent years as a competent, unremarkable merchant navigator before his ship, the slaver Princess, was captured off the coast of West Africa in 1719 by a pirate crew under Captain Howell Davis. Roberts, like so many skilled tradesmen this account has already described, was forced into the pirate crew specifically for his navigational expertise, a decision that would prove, within a matter of weeks, to be one of the most consequential recruitment choices any pirate captain of the era ever made without fully realizing it. Davis was killed in an ambush not long after, shot down by Portuguese soldiers during a raid on the island of Principe that had gone badly wrong, and the crew, following the genuinely democratic process this account has described repeatedly across tonight's journey, held a vote to choose his successor. Roberts, forced aboard only a matter of weeks earlier, and by his own later account, initially reluctant to embrace the pirate life at all, was elected captain by a crew that had, in that short span, apparently recognized in him exactly the combination of competence and nerve the job demanded. He is reported to have said, on accepting the command, that having dipped his hands in muddy water, he might as well swim in it as sink, a line preserved through Captain Charles Johnson's General History, a source whose reliability this account has already flagged as genuinely disputed, and so worth treating as broadly consistent with Roberts' documented character rather than a verified verbatim quotation. Roberts proved, almost immediately, to be a captain of extraordinary skill, and within his first year of command, he pulled off a capture that would have made most pirate careers on its own. Off the coast of Brazil, in late 1719, Roberts' fleet took a Portuguese vessel from a convoy of 42 sail, singling her out specifically because she rode noticeably lower in the water than her companions, a detail that told an experienced eye like Roberts everything it needed to know about what she was likely carrying. She turned out to be carrying an extraordinary cargo bound for Lisbon: gold, sugar, and, by several accounts, a diamond-studded cross, intended as a gift for the King of Portugal himself, along with tens of thousands of gold moidores. It remains, by most historians' reckoning, one of the single richest prizes taken by any pirate across the entire Golden Age, and it established Roberts, within months of an initially reluctant elevation to command, as a genuinely formidable and wealthy captain. What Roberts did with that reputation over the following 2 years was expand it methodically across an almost absurd geographic range: the Caribbean, the eastern seaboard of North America, and eventually back across the Atlantic to West Africa, taking prizes historians now estimate at somewhere between 300 and 400 vessels total, a figure that dwarfs the totals attributed to far more culturally famous pirates like Blackbeard by a considerable margin. Roberts achieved this scale partly through simple longevity, a nearly 4-year career, extraordinarily long by the standards of a trade where most captains were captured, killed, or forced into retirement within a year or two, and partly through the same combination of ruthless efficiency and genuine navigational skill that had gotten him elected in the first place. It was in the spring of 1720, with his reputation and his fleet both growing, that Roberts made the same calculation Peter Easton had made exactly a century before him, that Newfoundland's seasonal fishing fleets represented an enormous, largely undefended concentration of wealth and vessels, gathered predictably every summer in a region far enough from any serious naval presence that a well-armed pirate fleet could operate there with something close to total impunity. Roberts' flotilla, at this point numbering several vessels and several hundred men, turned north from the Caribbean, sailing directly toward the same cold Atlantic fishing grounds that had made Easton's fortune, and that would, within weeks, make Roberts's reputation as thoroughly feared as any pirate captain then sailing. What made the raid on Trepassey Harbor so effective wasn't overwhelming firepower. Roberts' flotilla, however well armed, was still vastly outnumbered by the sheer volume of vessels anchored in the harbor that morning. What made it effective was psychology, deployed with a deliberate theatricality that Roberts seems to have understood as well as any pirate captain of the era. The drums, the trumpets, the black flags, the guns fired not at any target, but simply into open air, to announce his arrival with maximum, unmistakable menace. Every element of the entrance was calculated to produce exactly the outcome it did produce. Total immediate panic among fishing crews who had no reason whatsoever to expect a fight to the death over cargo holds full of salted cod, and who made, almost universally, the entirely rational choice to abandon their vessels and flee ashore rather than risk their lives defending property against a force that had just announced itself with the specific, unmistakable intention of terrifying them into exactly that decision. By some contemporary accounts, every single one of the roughly 22 English vessels in the harbor that morning was abandoned by her crew within minutes, of Roberts' fleet entering, without a shot fired in genuine defense, an outcome so complete that it reads, in the surviving accounts, less like a battle and more like a demonstration of what modern military theorists would recognize as pure, effective psychological warfare, achieved by a Welsh former merchant navigator who'd been a reluctant pirate himself less than a year earlier. Roberts' crew spent the following days looting and, in a display of destruction that went well beyond simple robbery, burning the majority of the abandoned fishing vessels and their shore-based fish processing stages, an act of deliberate economic devastation against the Newfoundland fishery that colonial records describe as taking years for the affected communities to fully recover from. From the wreckage of that raid, Roberts selected his prize, a well-built vessel he judged superior to his current flagship, which he claimed, refitted, and renamed, following a pattern this account has already observed once tonight, with Samuel Bellamy doing much the same with the wider, 3 years earlier, the Royal Fortune, a name Roberts would attach, in fact, to a succession of vessels across the rest of his career, each new flagship inheriting the name of the one before it, as it was lost, captured, or judged no longer adequate to his growing ambitions. It's a small detail, but a telling one. Roberts didn't think of himself as commanding a single ship. He thought of himself as commanding an office, a role, a continuous identity that simply migrated from hull to hull as circumstances required, closer, in that specific sense, to a modern institutional mindset than to the romantic image of a captain bonded to one beloved vessel that popular pirate fiction would eventually build around figures like him. Roberts didn't stop at Trepassey. In the days following the raid, his fleet moved on to nearby waters, where a substantial French fishing fleet was also gathered, and there he made an even more consequential capture, a well-armed French vessel that he refitted, again, as his flagship, mounting her with as many as 26 or 28 guns depending on the source consulted, and carrying the Royal Fortune name forward into what would become the single most heavily armed and formidable ship of his entire career. It's worth noting, in fairness to the fuller historical picture, that not every encounter Roberts's fleet had in these waters ended in the total, bloodless capitulation Trepassey saw. French naval and merchant crews in the surrounding area put up considerably more organized resistance in at least one documented engagement, a reminder that the Trepassey raid's near-total success owed as much to the specific, undefended character of an English seasonal fishing fleet as it did to Roberts's tactics alone. News of the Newfoundland raids spread through the Atlantic maritime world with the speed such news always traveled at in this era, carried by the fleeing ship's own crews back to home ports, amplified with each retelling, until Bartholomew Roberts's name carried a weight of dread among merchant captains that few pirates of the entire Golden Age ever quite matched. Colonial governors up and down the eastern seaboard of North America wrote anxious letters to London demanding naval protection against a threat that seemed, for a period of months in 1720, to be capable of striking almost anywhere it chose, with almost no warning and almost no effective resistance. By 1721, Roberts had shifted his operations back across the Atlantic to the West African coast, the same waters where his career as a forced pirate had begun less than 2 years earlier, and it was there, off the coast of what is now Gabon, near a headland called Cape Lopez, that his extraordinary run finally ended. On February 10, 1722, Roberts' Royal Fortune was surprised at anchor by HMS Swallow, a Royal Navy warship under Captain Challoner Ogle that had been specifically hunting him for months, using a deceptive approach that led Roberts's lookouts to initially mistake her for an ordinary merchant vessel rather than the warship she actually was. What happened next has become one of the most vividly documented death scenes of the entire Golden Age of Piracy, preserved through the testimony of surviving crew members at the subsequent trial, and repeated consistently enough across multiple independent sources that historians treat the core details as reliably established rather than legendary embellishment. Roberts, by every account, met the engagement dressed with a deliberate, almost defiant flamboyance, a crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, a red feather in his hat, a gold chain with a diamond cross hanging around his neck. By some accounts, the very cross taken from that extraordinary Portuguese prize off Brazil 2 years earlier, and a pair of pistols slung on a silk sling across his shoulders. It was, by his own reported habit, exactly how he dressed for any engagement he expected to be serious. A captain who understood, as thoroughly as anyone in his trade, that a pirate's authority rested partly on genuine skill and partly on theatre, and who apparently saw no reason to abandon the second element in what would turn out to be the final hour of his life. The engagement was brief and, for Roberts personally, immediately fatal. A broadside of grape shot from the Swallow struck him in the throat within the opening minutes of the exchange, killing him almost instantly. What his crew did next tells you something genuinely remarkable about the man, or at least about how thoroughly his crew had internalized his own wishes on the matter, rather than let his body be captured, displayed, or subjected to the kind of public humiliation the Royal Navy reserved for notorious pirate captains. Roberts' crew, following what multiple accounts describe as his own standing instruction, given while he was still alive, that he never wished to be taken, dead or alive, weighted his body, and still dressed in the full crimson finery he'd chosen for the battle, dropped it over the side, into the sea off Cape Lopez, denying the crown the trophy it would otherwise have paraded through London as proof of the most successful pirate captain of the age, finally, definitively, defeated. It is, in its own way, a strange and fitting final image for an account that has spent this entire evening returning again and again to cold water as both threat and, occasionally, mercy. The most successful pirate of the Golden Age, given a burial identical in its basic mechanics to old Simon's aboard a very different ship on a very different night, sinking into the same cold Atlantic that had made and unmade so many careers across this entire story, wearing, as he went under, more wealth on his body than most of the men who'd served him would see across their entire lives. Roberts' crew did not escape the consequences of his death the way he himself had. HMS Swallow captured the Royal Fortune and her surviving company within hours of the engagement, and the resulting legal proceeding, held at Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast later that year, became the largest single pirate trial in recorded history. Roughly 272 men stood before the court, of whom 52 were ultimately hanged. Dozens more sentenced to indentured servitude in conditions scarcely better than slavery, and a smaller number acquitted on the same forced man defense that had freed Thomas Davis after the Wider's wreck 5 years earlier. The sheer scale of the proceeding, the volume of testimony, the careful legal distinctions drawn between willing pirates and forced or coerced crew members, the detailed accounts individual defendants gave of their own recruitment and conduct, makes the Cape Coast Castle trial records one of the single richest surviving primary sources historians have for understanding exactly how a pirate crew of this era actually functioned, member by individual member, in a level of granular detail that few other pirate companies' internal workings were ever documented in at all. Among the material entered into that trial's record were fragments and summaries of the Royal Fortune's own written articles, the actual governing document Roberts's crew had voted to live under, portions of which survive today as among the most complete and detailed sets of pirate articles known from the entire Golden Age. They included, among their provisions, exactly the kind of injury compensation schedule this account described earlier tonight aboard a very different, much colder ship. Specific sums owed from the company's plunder for the loss of a limb or an eye, sustained in the ship's service, before any ordinary shares were divided at all. Roberts' articles also banned gambling for money, required lights out below decks by 8 in the evening for fire safety, and mandated that boys and women be kept off the ship entirely, except by specific crew consent. Provisions that, taken together, paint a picture of a pirate company considerably more organized, more procedural, and in some respects more genuinely protective of its own members than almost any competing institution available to a working sailor anywhere in the Atlantic world of 1722, merchant marine or Royal Navy included. There's a specific, well-documented detail about Roberts worth including here, because it captures something true about how personal, and occasionally how petty, a pirate captain's grievances could become, even at the height of a genuinely historic career. Roberts flew more than one design of personal flag across his time in command, and among the most striking, described consistently in trial testimony and contemporary accounts, showed a human figure standing atop two skulls, each skull labeled with initials, ABH, beneath one, standing for a Barbadian's head, and AMH beneath the other, a Martiniquean's head, a direct, deliberately publicized threat aimed specifically at the governors and naval forces of Barbados and Martinique, two colonies whose warships had attacked his fleet and very nearly killed him in separate engagements earlier in his career. It's a small, almost petulant detail, sitting inside an otherwise sweeping historical narrative. And it's exactly the kind of detail that humanizes Roberts in a way the grander numbers, 400 prizes, 52 hanged crewmen, a diamond cross taken from a king's own gift, never quite managed to on their own. Whatever else Bartholomew Roberts was, he was also, apparently, a man who held a grudge, and who wanted the entire Atlantic maritime world to know exactly which two governments he held it against. There's a particular kind of vertigo in holding these two facts side by side. Bartholomew Roberts terrorized an entire ocean's worth of shipping, burned a fishing community's livelihood to the waterline in a single week, and by any modern ethical accounting was responsible for real, serious harm to a great many people who never volunteered to be part of his story. And also, genuinely, documentedly, without contradiction, he ran one of the most orderly, rule-governed, and in certain narrow respects, more equitable companies of working men then operating anywhere on the Atlantic. A company whose own members had voted him into power and could, in principle, have voted him back out of it, whose injured and maimed were owed a specific, itemized debt the whole company was bound to honor, and whose lights-out and fire safety rules protected exactly the kind of ordinary men this account has spent the whole night following, through cold, damp, disease, and grief. Both of these things are true about the same ship, the same articles, the same brief, violent career. History rarely offers the tidy moral clarity people sometimes wish it would, and Roberts's story, cold water and crimson silk and all, is as good an illustration of that as any this account could have chosen tonight. He was 39 or 40 years old when the Swallow's grape shot found him off Cape Lopez, having spent less than 4 years as a pirate captain and having risen, in that brief span, from a forced and reluctant navigator to the single most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age, by prize count. A run that started, in its most consequential turning point, in a foggy Newfoundland harbor full of undefended fishing boats. In exactly the kind of cold northern water this whole account keeps circling back to, night after night, ship after ship, captain after captain, all of them finding, in their own way, that the Atlantic's cold was never really optional. It was simply the price of admission to the only trade most of them had left. Roberts' articles, and the fire safety rule buried plainly inside them, lights out below decks by 8, bring tonight's journey back to the one part of shipboard life this account hasn't yet properly explored, the narrow, carefully guarded question of where, exactly, any warmth on a wooden ship was permitted to exist at all, and what it cost to keep even that much. The smell finds you on deck before you've even climbed down toward it. Wood smoke, and under it, the specific, mouth-watering smell of salt pork rendering in a pan, carried up through the forward hatch on a thin curl of grey smoke, that is, at this exact moment, the single warmest thing anywhere aboard this entire ship. It's coming from the galley, a cramped, brick-lined firebox set low and forward in the hull, and it is, without meaningful exception, the only open flame permitted anywhere aboard a wooden sailing vessel of this era, pirate, naval, or merchant alike. Everything else this ship needs fire for, light in the great cabin, warmth in the surgeon's small brazier you learned about weeks ago, exists at a scale so contained and so carefully watched that it barely qualifies as fire in the sense the galley hearth does. The galley is different. The galley is where a real fire burns, hot enough to boil a full cauldron of salt meat and dried peas, hot enough to bake what passes for fresh bread when flour and time both allow it, and it exists at all only because the ship's builders lined its firebox in brick and sand specifically to keep flame from ever touching the surrounding timber, and because every hand aboard, captain included, understands with total clarity exactly what happens to a wooden ship loaded with gunpowder, if that containment ever fails. Here's the thing about that containment, though. It's conditional, and the conditions are strict enough that a hot meal is, on this ship, a genuine luxury, rather than a daily guarantee. The galley fire gets doused, without exception and without appeal, the moment weather turns rough enough to risk a coal or an ember jumping its brick confines, which, on a North Atlantic voyage in these latitudes, this time of year, means considerably more often than anyone aboard would prefer. It gets doused during any engagement or suspected engagement, the instant a strange sail is sighted and the crew clears for action, because a battle is exactly the moment an open flame below decks becomes catastrophically dangerous rather than merely inconvenient, and it gets doused, as a standing rule under this ship's own articles, a rule you now know, from the trial records of a very different, very famous pirate crew, was close to universal practice across the entire Golden Age. Every night by 8 bells, regardless of weather, regardless of how cold the evening has turned, because a fire left burning unwatched through the night was judged by crews who'd clearly thought hard about exactly this risk, not worth whatever warmth or convenience it might have offered. The math of all those restrictions works out, in practice, to something like this. On a bad weather stretch, which this particular leg of the voyage has offered in genuine abundance, you might go 3 or 4 days at a stretch, eating entirely cold food, because the galley simply never gets a safe enough window to light at all. Hardtack, a dense flour and water biscuit baked hard enough to survive months of storage without spoiling, needs no fire to eat, which is precisely why it's the one food this ship never fully runs short of, and precisely why every hand aboard has developed their own private strategy for getting it down, soaking it in whatever liquids available to soften it, checking it first by rapping it against the table to knock loose the weevils that infest ship's biscuit, with a regularity so universal that period sailors developed their own grim gallows humor about it, joking that the biscuit had more legs than a table by the time a voyage ran its full length. Salt pork and salt beef, preserved in brine-filled casks that could keep meat theoretically edible for a year or more, likewise needed no cooking to consume, though nearly everyone aboard preferred it heated when the galley allowed, both for taste and for the simple, undeniable comfort of hot food in a cold body. Cheese, dried peas, whatever fruit or vegetables came off the most recent prize before they spoiled. This was, more or less, the full range of what a pirate crew's diet consisted of on a long ocean leg, and it's worth saying plainly that it compared, on the whole, reasonably well against what a Royal Navy or merchant crew of the same era typically ate, since a pirate ship's provisions came from whatever the last several prizes happened to be carrying, rather than from a single, standardized naval ration, meaning a fortunate string of captures could leave a pirate crew eating considerably better, for a stretch, than the king's own sailors were eating on the very same ocean. The man tending that galley fire today is called Robert Coswell, and the story of how he came to hold the single warmest post on this entire ship tells you something else worth knowing about how a pirate crew's written articles actually functioned in practice. Beyond the abstract compensation schedules, this account has already described twice tonight. Coswell lost his left leg below the knee 18 months ago, taken off by grapeshot during a boarding action on a different ship entirely, under a different captain, on a voyage that ended for him the moment the wound happened. Under the articles that crew sailed by, broadly consistent with the schedules this account has already described, and reflecting a standard genuinely common enough across surviving pirate articles that historians treat it as close to typical practice for the era, Coswell was owed a specific sum from the company's plunder for the loss of the limb, paid out before the ordinary shares were divided at all. What the articles didn't automatically solve was the harder, longer question underneath the immediate payment. What does a one-legged man do next, aboard a trade that runs almost entirely on physical labor, if he wants to keep sailing rather than take his settlement and try to build some kind of shoreside life with it instead? Coswell chose to keep sailing, and the crew that voted him aboard this ship some months later gave him the galley, a post that required real skill, genuine and constant vigilance, and almost no climbing, hauling, or the kind of sustained physical exertion his missing leg would have made difficult or impossible on deck or aloft. It's not charity exactly, and Coswell would likely bristle at anyone describing it that way. He runs that galley with a controlled, exacting competence that makes him one of the more genuinely respected hands aboard, cook's post or not. But it is, undeniably, a system working roughly as intended, a maimed man, compensated under the ship's own written rules, finding a genuine, valued, functioning place within the same company that could easily have simply put him ashore with his settlement and never thought of him again. By your 8th week aboard, you've learned to read Coswell's fire schedule the way you've learned to read every other rhythm of this ship, watching for the specific, telltale thread of smoke that means the galley's lit, timing your own movements to be nearby when a hot meal's actually possible, because on a ship this size, word travels fast and a hot meal draws a crowd. You've also learned, from Coswell himself, in the particular blunt, instructional way older hands pass knowledge to newer ones out here, exactly how careful the whole operation has to be. He shows you, one calm afternoon, when duty gives you a rare few idle minutes near the galley, the sandbox kept ready beside the firebox at all times, the leather buckets of seawater hung within immediate reach, the specific order of operations for dousing the fire fast if a call to quarters comes without warning. Knowledge, he insists, every hand aboard ought to have, cook's post or not, because a fire that gets away from its brick containment doesn't wait politely for the ship's actual cook to be the one who notices it. That caution isn't theoretical. Roughly 3 weeks back, before you'd fully settled into this ship's rhythms, a sudden squall caught the galley mid-meal, and a wave breaking hard over the bow sent enough water down the forward hatch to nearly swamp the firebox. Nearly, and not quite, because Coswell had the fire doused and the coals smothered inside seconds, moving with a speed that startled you at the time, before you understood how many times he'd clearly drilled exactly that response into pure reflex. Ship fires, when they did get away from their containment, were catastrophic in a way almost nothing else at sea could match. A wooden hull, tarred rigging, and a hold full of gunpowder gave a fire everything it needed to consume an entire vessel in a matter of minutes, far faster than any crew could realistically fight it once it took hold, and period accounts of ships lost to exactly this cause, pirate and otherwise, are common enough across the surviving record that every hand aboard understands the danger as something closer to religious conviction than abstract policy. The cold, restricted diet this ship runs on carries its own slower, less dramatic danger, one that took European medicine considerably longer to fully understand than the straightforward physics of fire. Scurvy, the debilitating and eventually fatal disease caused by prolonged vitamin C deficiency, which stalked essentially every long ocean voyage of the age of sail, regardless of flag or trade. Salt pork, salt beef, and hardtack, the reliable, storable core of this ship's diet, carry essentially none of it, and a crew sailing weeks or months without fresh fruit, vegetables, or the specific anti-scorbutic foods, period sailors had begun, through hard empirical experience, rather than any formal medical theory, to associate with staving off the disease's worst effects, could expect exactly the symptoms Kerr, the ship's surgeon, has already started watching for, with quiet, professional wariness: bleeding gums, loosening teeth, old wounds reopening, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to touch. Here's where a pirate crew's particular way of provisioning actually offered a real, if inconsistent, advantage over the more rigid rationing of a Royal Navy vessel. Because this ship's food supply came from whatever the last several prizes happened to be carrying, rather than from a single standardized allotment loaded once at the start of a voyage, a fortunate run of captures, a merchantman carrying citrus bound for a Caribbean garrison, a trading vessel with fresh vegetables still aboard from a recent port call, could genuinely refill the crew's anti-scorbutic reserves in a way naval rationing structures rarely allowed for mid-voyage. It wasn't reliable, it wasn't systematic, but it meant this crew's actual, lived experience of scurvy risk fluctuated with the fortunes of the voyage itself, rising through long stretches without a decent prize, and falling again, sometimes dramatically, whenever a lucky capture happened to be carrying exactly what the ship's diet was missing. One more way piracy's genuine unpredictability cut, unexpectedly, in the crew's favor rather than against it. News reaches this ship the way most news reaches a vessel at sea, second-hand, weeks stale, carried aboard by whatever crew or captured prize happens to have heard it more recently than you have. It's a Dutch sailor off a captured trading vessel, held briefly aboard while his own ship's cargo gets divided out, who brings the story that settles hardest over the crew that evening. A merchant vessel out of Amsterdam, sailing these same cold waters not 2 months back, lost entirely to a galley fire that got away from its containment during a night watch when the cook, by the Dutchman's account, had left a bank of coals smouldering against standing orders rather than properly doused. Every hand aboard, the whole vessel, gone, no wreck survivors, nothing but a name added to the long, largely unrecorded list of ships the sea simply swallowed without explanation. The kind of loss that never makes it into any official log because there was, in the end, nobody left to write the account. Coswell doesn't say much when the story makes its way to him, second-hand, like everything else, except to nod once, grimly, and go back to banking his own coals with the same exacting, practiced care he brings to every part of his post. You understand, watching him, that this is exactly the kind of story that reinforces every rule he's already drilled into you and everyone else who's spent time near his galley these past weeks. Not abstract caution anymore, but a specific, named tragedy that happened to specific, unnamed men not so different from any of you, on water not so different from the water currently sliding past this hull. There's a genuine warmth to be found here too, though, and it would be a disservice to this whole evening's journey to let the fire story close on dread alone. 3 nights later, with weather calm enough to hold steady for a full day, Coswell produces something close to a proper feast: salt beef stewed soft, with the last of a captured onion supply, a rare batch of ship's duff, a dense, boiled pudding studded with whatever dried fruit the hold still has to offer, and, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, bread baked fresh that same afternoon, rather than the eternal, weevil-checked hardtack. The whole crew eats in shifts, as always, but the mood below decks that evening is lighter than it's been in weeks. Rusk, trading some half-remembered Bristol joke with Coyle, that has them both laughing hard enough to draw irritated looks from men trying to sleep nearby, and you find yourself, for a stretch of maybe 20 minutes, genuinely, simply warm, not from any fire reaching you directly, but from a full stomach, familiar company, and the particular, uncomplicated relief of an ordinary good evening aboard a ship that has given you precious few of them. It doesn't last. It never does. Out here, the fire gets doused at 8 bells, same as always, and the cold reclaims the berth deck within the hour, same as always. But you've learned, these past weeks, exactly how much a single good evening can carry a crew through the ordinary hardship waiting on the other side of it. And Coswell, watching his galley go dark for the night with the same careful attention he brings to lighting it each morning, seems to understand that arithmetic better than almost anyone else aboard. Coswell's path to the galley wasn't unusual, as it turns out, and it's worth widening the lens briefly to say so. Contemporary accounts and later maritime scholarship both note that ship's cooks across the age of sail, naval, merchant, and pirate vessels alike, were disproportionately drawn from among sailors who'd lost a hand, an arm, or a leg in earlier service, the post being one of the few aboard a working ship that demanded real skill and judgment without requiring the sustained physical mobility that rigging work, gunnery, or general deck labor all still needed. It's a pattern documented clearly enough in Royal Navy records of the era that historians treat it as a genuine, semi-formalized practice, rather than mere coincidence, a rough, unofficial accommodation built into the structure of shipboard labor itself, existing well before any of the more famous pirate articles' explicit compensation schedules ever put a number on what a lost limb was owed. What makes the pirate version of this same practice notable isn't that it existed. Plenty of merchant and naval cooks shared Coswell's general circumstances, but that it existed alongside a written, voted-on guarantee of compensation that most disabled sailors serving the Crown or a merchant company could only hope for informally, if they got it at all. A Royal Navy sailor who lost a leg in the King's service depended on the uncertain mercies of a pension system that period accounts describe, with some consistency, as slow, underfunded, and frequently indifferent to the men it was theoretically meant to support. A pirate sailor who lost a leg in his company's service had, at least on paper and at least under captains who honored their own articles, an immediate, specific, collectively guaranteed payment followed, if Coswell's own path aboard this ship is any indication, by a real, ongoing place within the same company that had voted those articles into existence in the first place. Neither system was perfect, but it's difficult, sitting with both side by side, not to notice which one actually tried harder. There's one more piece of the galley's daily rhythm, worth knowing before this account moves on, because it ties back directly to the very first night of tonight's journey, and closes a small loop this account opened hours ago in a different, colder hammock. The grog ration, the watered rum this account already explained, does considerably less to actually warm a man than sailors of the era believed. Was, by long-standing convention aboard most vessels of this period, mixed and distributed from a spot near the galley itself, timed deliberately to land close to whatever hot meal the day's weather allowed. It wasn't accident. Ship's quartermasters understood, even without the physiological explanation modern medicine would eventually supply, that pairing the ration with genuine hot food produced a steadier, more sustained sense of warmth and morale than the rum alone ever could. And Coswell, for his part, treats the timing of his own fire schedule as inseparable from the timing of the daily ration, coordinating with the quartermaster each morning in a brief, practical exchange that has become, over your weeks aboard, as reliable a fixture of shipboard life as the watch bell itself. It means something, walking away from this chapter, to realize how much of this ship's entire daily architecture, the fire lit and doused on schedule, the ration timed around it, the compensation owed to the man tending it, the written rule keeping it contained through the night, exists as a kind of quiet, collective answer to the single hardest fact tonight's story keeps returning to, that a wooden ship sailing cold water has almost nothing, structurally, to offer its crew in the way of real warmth, and that everything genuinely warm about a voyage like this one had to be built, deliberately, by the people living through it, out of rules they'd voted on, food they'd fought to keep hot, and a cook who'd earned his post the hardest possible way, and now guarded it, every single morning, like the small, hard-won victory it actually was. None of it arrived by accident, and none of it would have existed at all if enough men, across enough voyages, hadn't decided, deliberately and repeatedly, that a shipmate's warmth was worth the trouble of writing down as a rule, rather than leaving to chance. Was never really about fire alone, not aboard this ship, and not aboard any of the others this account has carried you through tonight. It was about what a crew chose to owe each other, and there's no better place left to close that argument than with the document every one of these ships, in its own way, kept coming back to, the articles themselves. November 1719. Somewhere off the coast of North Carolina, a pirate captain named Charles Vane stood before his own crew and lost his command. Not to a Royal Navy broadside, not to mutiny in the violent sense the word usually suggests, but to a formal, recorded vote, a count of hands, taken in the open, following a set of written rules every man aboard had agreed to when he signed on. Vane's crime, in his crew's own judgment, was cowardice. Faced with a French warship he judged too dangerous to engage, he'd ordered his ship to run rather than fight, a decision his quartermaster, a man named John Rackham, and a majority of the company considered a betrayal of the aggressive, prize-taking purpose they'd all signed on for. They didn't kill him. They didn't even maroon him immediately, in most tellings. They simply declared him no longer captain, elected Rackham in his place, and eventually, after further disagreement, set Vane and a handful of loyal followers adrift in a captured sloop, leaving him to make his own way in the world, without the ship, the crew, or the authority he'd held only hours earlier. This is the story of the document that made that vote possible, and every vote like it across the entire Golden Age of Piracy. The ship's articles, the single most consequential and least understood institution in the whole of pirate history. Ship's articles were not, whatever popular imagination sometimes suggests, an informal understanding or an unwritten code of honor among thieves. They were, on the vast majority of Golden Age pirate vessels for which any documentation survives, actual written contracts, drafted, debated, and formally agreed to by an entire crew before a voyage began, often signed or marked by every man aboard, sometimes sworn to on a Bible where one was available, and, on at least one documented occasion involving Bartholomew Roberts's crew, on a hatchet instead, when no Bible could be found, and the company judged the oath important enough to swear on whatever solemn object was actually at hand. Surviving fragments and full copies of these articles, preserved through trial testimony, captured documents, and the occasional surviving original, show remarkable consistency in their core structure across crews separated by years and thousands of miles of ocean, suggesting a shared, transmitted tradition, rather than each crew independently reinventing the same basic institution from scratch. At the center of nearly every surviving set of articles sat the single most radical structural feature of pirate governance, radical enough that it's worth stating plainly rather than glossing past. The captain was elected by vote of the company and could be removed the same way. This stood in complete, deliberate contrast to every other maritime institution these men had ever served under. A Royal Navy captain held his commission from the Crown and answered to the Admiralty, not his crew. A common sailor who judged his captain a coward or a fool had no formal recourse whatsoever beyond the exceedingly rare and dangerous last resort of outright mutiny, itself a hanging offense regardless of how justified the grievance. A merchant captain answered to the ship's owners, men who were, in the overwhelming majority of cases, sitting comfortably ashore and considerably more interested in cargo delivered on schedule than in the conditions their hired crew endured getting it there. A pirate captain answered to the men standing directly in front of him in an open vote, with the outcome of that vote directly and immediately enforceable, because unlike a Royal Navy crew, a pirate crew was, in the moment of the vote itself, holding the very weapons that made their judgment matter. Charles Vane discovered exactly how immediately enforceable that judgment could be. So, a few years later, and by several accounts, did other captains across the era who lost their commands to votes of no confidence for cowardice, excessive cruelty, or simple incompetence, a pattern documented clearly enough across multiple crews that historians treat elected, revocable pirate captaincy as one of the genuinely distinctive and well-established features separating Golden Age piracy from every other maritime hierarchy operating in the same Atlantic world. It's worth being precise about what this democratic structure did and didn't mean in practice, because it would be a real disservice to romanticize it past what the record actually supports. A pirate captain retained near absolute authority in one specific, crucial circumstance: during active combat, when split-second decisions needed a single clear voice rather than a debate. Most articles granted the captain unquestioned command. A practical concession every crew seems to have understood was necessary for their own survival, regardless of how democratic their governance was in calmer moments. Outside of battle, though, on questions of where to sail, which prizes to pursue, how plunder should be divided, and whether the captain himself remained fit for the job, the company's vote genuinely governed. A hybrid structure, tactical autocracy paired with broader democratic accountability, that some modern historians studying the period have noted anticipates, in rough and unintentional outline, governance structures that wouldn't become common in ordinary working life, anywhere in the wider world, for a very long time. Standing beside the captain in this system, and in genuine practice checking his authority even more directly on a day-to-day basis, was the quartermaster, a role this account has mentioned several times tonight, without yet fully explaining, and one considerably more powerful than the term suggests to modern ears. The quartermaster, also elected by the company, held direct responsibility for dividing plunder fairly, for arbitrating disputes between crew members, and, on many ships, for administering punishment for violations of the articles. A division of labor that deliberately kept the ship's disciplinary authority separate from its combat authority. A captain who wanted a man punished, on many pirate vessels, couldn't simply order it himself. He needed the quartermaster's independent judgment that the punishment was warranted under the articles the whole crew had agreed to. It's a genuine separation of powers, crude and improvised as it was, existing on wooden ships, flying black flags, roughly 70 years before any formal political theorist would articulate the same basic principle as a foundation for legitimate government ashore. The compensation schedules this account has referenced several times tonight deserve in this final chapter their fullest and most specific accounting, because the actual numbers tell a story the general description alone can't quite capture. Surviving articles attributed to Captain John Phillips, reconstructed through trial testimony from his crew's 1724 capture, itemized payments in pieces of 8, the standard Spanish silver coin that functioned as something close to a common currency across the entire Atlantic piratical world. With real specificity, 600 pieces of 8 for the loss of a right arm, 500 for a left, 500 for an eye or a finger. These figures, preserved through court testimony, rather than the more contested Johnson's general history, this account has already flagged for its disputed reliability, carry a stronger claim to historical accuracy than some of the more colorful pirate legends this evening has necessarily treated with greater caution. Though even here, a careful account should note that exact figures varied somewhat between different crews' articles, and that Phillips's specific numbers shouldn't be assumed to represent a single universal standard rather than one crew's own particular agreement. Set those numbers against what a maimed sailor could actually expect from the crown he'd served instead. English law of the period did technically provide for disabled sailors and soldiers through a fund associated with Greenwich Hospital and related charitable and pension mechanisms, but period accounts and later historical scholarship both describe the actual, lived experience of claiming that support as slow, bureaucratically punishing, and frequently inadequate to the real cost of survival, with a serious permanent injury. A wounded sailor might wait months or years for a payment that a pirate cruise articles guaranteed, in principle, the moment the company's next prize was divided. Neither system was generous by any modern standard, but one of them was voted on by the men it covered and paid out by their own hands, and the other depended entirely on the goodwill of institutions that had already demonstrated, across generations of underpaid, underfed, forcibly recruited naval service, exactly how much goodwill they actually extended to ordinary sailors. Shares worked on a similarly leveled, if not perfectly equal, principle, where a merchant or naval vessel of the era distributed pay according to a rigid hierarchy that gave a captain many multiples of an ordinary seaman's wage. Pirate articles typically divided plunder in shares that kept the gap between captain and crew comparatively modest. A captain and quartermaster might draw 1.5 or 2 shares to an ordinary hand's single share, a real but limited premium for rank and responsibility, rather than the vast categorical gulf separating an admiral's compensation from a common sailor's aboard almost any legitimate naval vessel of the same period. A forced man, once he'd served long enough to be trusted, and a volunteer who'd signed on from the very first article signing, generally drew the same share for the same risk, a rough equality that, again, existed nowhere else with this degree of formal, written consistency anywhere else in the Atlantic maritime world of 1720. The articles governed more than money, and command too, reaching into the ordinary daily texture of shipboard life, in ways this account has already touched on, piece by piece, across tonight's journey, without naming the source directly. The fire safety rules that kept Coswell's galley strictly contained and dark by 8 bells each night. The ban on lit candles below decks that made your very first night aboard, weeks and chapters ago now, as dark and as cold as it was. The requirement that weapons be kept clean and ready. Restrictions on gambling that period captains judged corrosive to a crew's cohesion and discipline. And, on some ships, specific protections for women and boys brought aboard captured vessels, rules whose enforcement varied considerably by crew and by captain, but whose mere written existence tells you something about what at least some pirate companies considered worth formally prohibiting rather than simply leaving to individual conscience. It would be dishonest, in this final accounting, to let the articles stand as some kind of uncomplicated moral triumph, and this account owes you, after everything else tonight has tried to treat with equal honesty, the same care here. Not every captain honored his own crew's articles faithfully. Not every crew's vote was genuinely free of intimidation or manipulation by whichever faction held the most immediate physical power in the moment. Forced men, and this account has followed several of them closely tonight, Rusk and Thomas Davis, and the fisherman Peter Easton, conscripted a century before either of them, remained forced men, articles or no articles, denied the basic freedom to simply walk away from a life they'd never chosen, however fairly that life's internal rules were eventually applied to them once they were trapped inside it. The articles were a genuine, remarkable achievement in collective self-governance among men society had almost universally abandoned. They were not, and were never intended to be, a system of justice extending outward to the merchant crews, the enslaved people, and the coastal communities that pirate violence continued to fall on throughout this entire era, Bartholomew Roberts's burned Newfoundland fishing stages included. Charles Vane, set adrift by the very system this account has just spent several segments describing, didn't get a happy ending. He was later captured attempting to rebuild his fortunes, tried, and hanged at Port Royal in 1721, a fate that met the overwhelming majority of Golden Age pirates, regardless of how democratically or autocratically they'd run their ships. The articles never promised anyone a good ending. They promised, at most, a fair process along the way to whatever ending the sea, the noose, or old age eventually handed you, and even that limited promise, weighed against what almost every other institution in the Atlantic world of 1720 offered an ordinary sailor, was genuinely remarkable. Historians studying the period have, in recent decades, increasingly drawn a direct line between these written pirate articles and the broader currents of Enlightenment-era political thought developing simultaneously ashore: social contract theory, the emerging idea that legitimate authority derived from the consent of the governed rather than inherited right, ideas that men like John Locke were formalizing in print during roughly this same window of decades. Whether pirate crews were directly influenced by that ashore intellectual current, or whether both emerged independently from the same broader 18th century questioning of traditional hierarchy, remains a genuinely open question among scholars, and this account won't claim more certainty than the evidence supports. What isn't in serious dispute is the practical fact of it. Men with no formal education, no political theory training, operating entirely outside the law, independently arrived at written, voted, revocable governance structures that gave ordinary working sailors more direct control over their own conditions, their own leadership, and their own compensation for injury than those same men could have found in almost any legitimate employment available to them anywhere in the Atlantic world of their time. Somewhere on a ship not so different from the one this account has followed you through for most of tonight, that same document, articles voted on, signed, sworn to on whatever Bible or hatchet happened to be closest, is doing exactly the quiet, structural work this whole story has tried to make visible. It's why old Simon's share found its way into a fund for the crew's own sick and injured, rather than simply vanishing the moment he went over the rail. It's why Coswell stands at his galley today, instead of having been quietly put ashore, unwanted, the moment his leg made him less useful on deck. It's why the captain's marginally warmer cabin was never quite warm enough, relative to everyone else's genuine cold, to escape the crew's own watchful sense of what he was and wasn't owed by comparison. None of it made the North Atlantic any warmer. None of it stopped the fever, the frostbite, the storms that took the wider and nearly took this ship more than once across the weeks this account has walked you through. But it changed, in ways that mattered enormously to the men actually living through it, whose burden that cold ultimately was, and how much of it any one man was expected to carry alone. By the time this particular voyage turns south again, back toward warmer water and easier duty, weeks from tonight, Rusk's frostbitten fingers will have healed clean, exactly as Kerr predicted the night he first treated them. Coyle will have stood his first full watch again, thinner but steady, the particular pride of a boy who survived something and is determined not to be treated like glass because of it. Coswell will still be lighting his galley fire each calm morning and dousing it each night at 8 bells, the same careful ritual, voyage after voyage, that has quietly kept this entire crew fed and this entire ship intact. And somewhere in a ledger the quartermaster keeps, old Simon's name will still be recorded, his share accounted for, his death folded into the ship's own memory of itself, in the only permanent way a company like this one had to offer. Not a monument, not a grave anyone could visit, just an honest entry in a book, and a crew that remembered him because the articles they'd all signed told them, in their own quiet way, that remembering was part of what they owed each other. There's a broader wonder worth sitting with here, one this account has been building toward across every chapter of tonight's journey, without quite naming it directly until now. Piracy, in the popular imagination, tends to be remembered almost entirely through its violence and its greed. The raids, the captures, the black flag, raised as a threat of no quarter given. All of that violence was real, and this account has never tried to soften or excuse it. Bartholomew Roberts really did burn a fishing community's livelihood to the waterline at Trepassey, and Peter Easton really did conscript men against their will to crew his Newfoundland fleet. And neither of those facts becomes less true because the same men, in the same era, also built genuinely remarkable structures of mutual obligation among themselves. But it's worth asking, honestly, why so many separate, unconnected crews, operating across different oceans and different decades, kept independently arriving at roughly the same democratic solution: the vote, the written compensation, the elected and revocable captain. If not because something about the specific desperation of their circumstances made that solution feel, to the men actually living it, less like an ideological choice and more like simple, obvious common sense. Consider what these men actually were, most of them, before they ever signed a set of articles: forced sailors taken off captured merchantmen, escaped or freed men of African descent, who'd found nowhere else in the entire Atlantic world willing to grant them an equal share and an equal vote. Veterans of Royal Navy service who'd survived years of brutal discipline and inadequate pay under a hierarchy that never once consulted them about anything. Fishermen conscripted by a pirate admiral, wealthy enough to eventually retire into European aristocracy, while they got nothing but a hard winter and an uncertain return home. Every single man this account has followed tonight: Rusk, Coyle, Kerr, Coswell, Thomas Davis, John Julian, the 52 hanged at Cape Coast Castle, and the handful acquitted alongside them, arrived at a pirate ship's deck by way of some failure, large or small, in the ordinary legitimate world's willingness to treat him fairly. What they built aboard those ships, however imperfectly and however violently it coexisted with everything else, piracy also was, represented, for a great many of them, the first and only institution in their entire working lives that had ever bothered to ask them what they thought, and to write the answer down, and to actually mean it. None of it changed the temperature of the water. That's the plain, unromantic truth this account has to leave you with, because every other kind of comfort this story has offered tonight was real only within its own honest limits. The Atlantic off Newfoundland in April was exactly as cold in 1720 as it had been in 1612, when Peter Easton's forced fishermen first felt it, and exactly as cold as it remains today, indifferent entirely to whether the ship sailing through it flew a black flag, a national ensign, or no flag at all. Rusk's frostbitten fingers healed because Kerr caught the injury early, and the articles gave him a warm hammock to recover in, not because the cold itself relented even slightly on his behalf. Old Simon still died. The Whyda's 144, still drowned in water, that gave a pirate admiral's fortune and a forced fisherman's labor the exact same indifferent, freezing welcome. Bartholomew Roberts, wrapped in crimson silk and diamonds, sank through the identical cold water that had already claimed a Welsh sailmaker's hammock mate 3 years and several hundred miles away. What the articles offered, in the end, was never protection from the cold itself. It was something more modest and, in its own way, more durable. The assurance that whatever the cold, the sea, and the noose eventually took from you, it would be witnessed, recorded, and honored by the only community most of these men had left. A promise: no ship's timber, no galley fire, no watchcoat, however carefully rationed or fairly distributed, could ever quite match on its own. That's what actually kept a pirate crew's hardest nights survivable, more than any of the physical defenses this account has spent all evening carefully cataloguing. Not warmth, witness. Go back, one last time, to where tonight began. April 17th, 1717. Ice thick as a thumb on the Whyda's shrouds. 146 men aboard a ship that had, only weeks earlier, been the wealthiest pirate vessel afloat. 2 of them lived to see morning. It's a hard place to have started, and it's an even harder place to end on its own. So end instead on what came after, on everything this account has spent tonight trying to hold up beside that cold, a sailmaker's mate whose frostbitten hand healed because a surgeon caught it early, and a written article gave him a warm hammock to recover in. A one-legged cook who found, in a company that voted him a place, rather than pitying him one, something closer to dignity than most disabled sailors of his era ever got offered anywhere else. A boy who nearly didn't survive a fever, and did, and asked, first thing, whether he'd missed his watch. A dead man's name, kept safe in a ledger, because a crew of forced men and volunteers alike had decided, together, that remembering was a debt they owed each other. The cold never left any of them. It's still out there tonight, the same Atlantic, the same indifferent water, moving the same way it moved 300 years ago, past a wrecked slave ship's bell that would wait 2.5 centuries to be found. But so is the other thing this whole story has been quietly following alongside it. The hammock offered, the shirt shared, the vote taken, the fire lit and banked, and lit again each morning by hands that had earned the right to tend it. You're warm right now. You're dry. You're not 4 feet above cold bilge water, waiting on a bell. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.